The courtroom fell silent as Rosalind Vale laid the forged deed on the judge's bench. Her hand didn't shake. The man who had abandoned her at the train station 6 months ago sat sweating in the front row, his lawyer already reaching for his briefcase. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. The ledger in her other hand proved something far worse than broken promises. It proved theft, conspiracy, and a scheme that had bled Wade Mercer's ranch dry for years. She had come to Texas with nothing. Now she was about to expose everything. Stay with me until the end to see how a woman with empty pockets brought an empire of lies crashing down. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the September heat like a rusted blade, and Rosalind Vale stepped onto the platform at Cassidy Junction with her entire life compressed into one battered suitcase and a carpet bag that smelled of lavender and hope. The Texas sun hammered down on her bonnet, and dust devils spun across the empty street beyond the depot. She scanned the scattered faces on the platform, weathered ranchers, a family herding children toward a wagon, two cowboys arguing over a horse. But none of them was him. None of them was Thomas Garrett, the man whose letters had promised her a home, a future, a life worth crossing half the country to claim. She stood there as the other passengers dispersed, as the train hissed and groaned and finally pulled away, leaving her alone on the sun-bleached planks. Her fingers tightened on the handle of her suitcase. She waited. The sun climbed higher, the platform emptied. Still, she waited. By the time the station master approached, his expression already apologetic, Rosalind had counted every nail in the depot's warped boards and memorized the pattern of cracks in the water barrel beside the door. "Miss," he said quietly, pulling an envelope from his vest pocket. "This came for you yesterday." The paper was expensive, cream-colored, sealed with red wax. Her name was written across the front in Thomas's careful script. For one wild moment, she thought it might be directions to his ranch, an explanation for the delay, an apology for making her wait. She broke the seal. The letter inside was 3 sentences long. "Miss Vale, circumstances have changed since our correspondence began. I have entered into an engagement with Miss Catherine Holbrook of San Antonio. I trust you will find your own arrangements. T. Garrett." Rosalind read it twice, then a third time, though the words didn't change. The station master shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, clearly waiting for tears or hysteria or some display of feminine collapse that would allow him to offer comfort and send her on the next train east. She gave him none of it. "Where's the land office?" she asked, her voice level. He blinked. "Ma'am?" "The land office. Where is it?" "2 streets over, but thank you." She picked up her suitcase and carpet bag and walked off the platform without looking back. The land office was a narrow building wedged between a saloon and a feed store, its windows thick with dust. Inside, a clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up from a stack of claim papers, his expression cycling rapidly from surprise to skepticism to thinly veiled amusement. "Help you, miss?" "I need information on available homesteads," Rosalind said. She set her bags down and pulled off her gloves with deliberate care, buying herself time to steady her voice. "Within walking distance of town." The clerk's smirk widened. "You looking to file a claim?" "I'm looking for information. Can you provide it or not?" Something in her tone made him straighten. He pulled out a ledger, flipped through pages, and tapped an entry near the bottom. "There's the old Pritchard place, about 3 miles northeast, 160 acres. House is still standing, or was last time anybody checked. Owner died 2 years back, no heirs. It'll revert to open territory if nobody claims it by end of month." "What's the filing fee?" $14. "But miss, that place is—" "I'll take it." She opened her reticule and counted out coins onto the desk. $14. It was half of what she had left in the world, but Thomas Garrett's letter had made one thing very clear. She had no one to rely on but herself. The clerk stared at the money, then at her. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. That house is half collapsed. There's no well. The land hasn't been worked in years. A woman alone out there." "The papers," Rosalind said quietly. "Please." He filled them out in silence, his pen scratching across the forms. When he pushed them across the desk for her signature, he added, almost gently, There's a boarding house on 2nd Street. Mrs. Callahan takes in respectable women. Might be you'd want to reconsider. Thank you for your concern." Rosalind signed her name, took her copy of the claim, and walked out into the brutal noon sun. She found the Pritchard place by following the clerk's directions and her own stubborn refusal to stop walking. 3 miles in the heat, her good traveling boots raising dust with every step, her bags growing heavier and her water nearly gone by the time she crested a low rise and saw it. The house, if it could still be called that, listed to one side like a drunk leaning on a bar. Half the roof had caved in. The windows were empty sockets. The door hung from one hinge. Beyond it, scrub grass and mesquite stretched to the horizon, broken only by a few struggling cottonwoods and the skeleton of what might have once been a barn. Rosalind set down her bags and stood there, breathing hard, her dress soaked with sweat and her throat raw with thirst. She thought of Thomas Garrett's neat handwriting. "I trust you will find your own arrangements." "Well," she said aloud to the ruined house and the indifferent sky, "here they are." She spent the rest of that afternoon exploring the wreckage. The main structure was beyond saving. The roof beams had rotted through, and the floor was a hazard of broken planks and animal nests. But behind the house, she found a storage shed that was still mostly intact. It was barely 10 feet square, with a dirt floor and gaps in the walls wide enough to let in fingers of sunlight, but the roof was sound. She dragged her bags inside, swept out the worst of the debris with a broken board, and sat down on her suitcase to take stock. She had $29 left, one change of clothes, a few books, a small sewing kit, a canteen that was now empty. No food, no tools, no friends within 1,000 miles, and she had a homestead claim in her name. She pulled out the claim paper and smoothed it across her knee, reading it over in the fading light. 160 acres, all hers, as long as she could prove she was working the land, as long as she could survive. The sun was setting when she heard the horse. Rosalind stood quickly, her heart hammering. Through the gaps in the shed wall, she could see a rider approaching from the west, silhouetted against the orange sky. A man, alone, on a big gray horse. He rode with the easy posture of someone who belonged out here, who knew this land the way she knew the streets of St. Louis, intimately, instinctively. He reined in about 20 yards from the shed and sat there, looking at the ruin of the Pritchard house, then at the shed, then at her face visible through the doorway. His face was shadowed by his hat brim, but she could see enough to note the hard line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, the way his hand rested near, but not on, the gun at his hip. "You're trespassing," he said. His voice was rough, flat, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. "No, sir, I'm not." Rosalind stepped out of the shed, lifting her chin. "I filed a claim this morning. This is my land." He dismounted in one smooth motion, keeping the horse between them. "You filed a claim?" "Yes." "On the Pritchard place?" "Yes." He pushed his hat back and she got her first clear look at his face, weathered, 30-ish, with a scar cutting through one eyebrow and eyes the color of creek water in winter, gray-green and just as cold. He looked her over, taking in her dusty traveling dress, her city boots, her empty hands. "Lady," he said slowly, "do you have any idea what you just did? I claimed a homestead that was about to revert to open territory. The clerk told me—" "The clerk," he laughed, short and sharp. "The clerk told you there's no well. Did he also mention the nearest water source is 2 miles south, on my property? Did he tell you this place is in a basin that floods every spring and bakes dry every summer? Did he explain that the reason Pritchard drank himself to death was because this land broke him?" Rosalind felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. "He mentioned the well. I'll manage." "You'll manage." The cowboy looked at her for a long moment, then at the shed, then back at her. "Where's your husband?" "I don't have one." "Your father? Brother?" "In St. Louis." "Then what in God's name are you doing out here alone?" The question cracked something open inside her chest. She thought of Thomas Garrett's letter, still folded in her reticule. Circumstances have changed. She thought of the station master's pitying eyes, the clerk's smirk, the way everyone assumed she would break. "Building a life," she said quietly. Same as anyone. The cowboy stared at her. Then he shook his head, gathered his reins, and swung back into the saddle. You've got until sundown tomorrow to clear out. After that, I can't be responsible for what happens to you out here. This is my land, Rosalind repeated. That piece of paper doesn't mean a damn thing if you're dead. He wheeled the gray horse around. There's snakes, coyotes. Men worse than either. You want to die proving a point? That's your business. But I'm not riding out here in a week to bury what's left of you. He spurred the horse into a trot and was gone, vanishing into the gathering dusk. Rosalind stood alone in the emptiness, watching him go. Then she turned back to the shed, to her bags, to the broken boards and the dirt floor, and the future she'd paid $14 to claim. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the doorway of the shed with her back against the frame, watching shadows shift across the prairie. Twice she heard coyotes yipping in the distance. Once, something large rustled through the scrub grass near the collapsed barn. She gripped the handle of her suitcase and waited for dawn. When the sun finally rose, she inventoried her resources with the cold clarity of someone who had run out of alternatives. $29. One canteen. The clothes on her back. And scattered around the ruined homestead, weathered boards, bent nails, and the stubborn remains of someone else's failed dream. She started with the boards. The collapsed section of the main house yielded planks that were warped but still solid. She dragged them out one by one, splinters digging into her palms, sweat soaking through her dress before the morning was half gone. She had no hammer, so she used a flat rock. She had no saw, so she broke the boards where they were already cracked and stacked them by length. By noon, she had the beginnings of a wall. Her hands were bleeding by then, her palms crossed with shallow cuts from splintered wood and rough nails. She tore strips from her petticoat and wrapped them around her fingers, then kept working. She didn't know what she was building exactly, shelter, maybe, or just proof that she could build something. But she didn't stop. The sun was directly overhead when she heard the horse again. She looked up, shading her eyes, and saw the same cowboy from the night before. He sat on his gray horse about 50 yards out, just watching. She waited for him to ride closer, to repeat his warning, to tell her again that she was going to die out here. Instead, he sat there for a long moment, then turned and rode away without a word. Rosalind went back to work. By evening, she had framed 3 walls against the side of the shed, bracing them with scavenged posts and whatever nails she could pull from the wreckage. It wasn't much. It wasn't even particularly straight. But it was hers, and it was standing. She sat down in the dirt, her whole body aching, and allowed herself one quiet moment of victory. Then she opened her canteen and took the smallest sip she could manage, because the water was almost gone, and she still hadn't solved that problem. The cowboy came back the next morning with a wagon. Rosalind heard it before she saw it. The creak of wheels, the jingle of harness. She stood up from where she'd been trying to pry nails out of a rotted board and wiped her hands on her ruined skirt. The wagon rolled to a stop near the shed, and the cowboy climbed down without a word. In the bed of the wagon, she could see fresh-cut lumber, a barrel, coiled rope, and a canvas tarp. "What's this?" she asked. He pulled a board from the stack and walked past her to examine her work. He ran his hand along the crooked wall, tested a joint with his boot, and shook his head. "This won't hold through the first storm." "It's holding now." "Barely." He dropped the board and turned to face her. "You planning to die out here, or you planning to live?" "Live." "Then you're building it wrong." He walked back to the wagon and started unloading lumber. "Corner posts go in first, sunk 3 feet deep. You brace them before you add walls, and you don't use boards this warped unless you've got no choice." Rosalind watched him work, her pride warring with the practical understanding that he was right. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." He set a post in the ground and started shoveling dirt around it with a spade she hadn't noticed in the wagon. "But if you're staying, you're doing it right. I'm not having a dead woman on my conscience because she was too stubborn to accept help." "Why do you care?" He paused, the spade in his hands, and looked at her with those cold creek water eyes. "Because I saw you yesterday," he said quietly, bleeding into the boards, still working. "And I figured if you were fool enough to fight this land alone, the least I could do was make sure you had a fighting chance." He went back to digging, and after a moment, Rosalind picked up a board and brought it to him. They worked through the morning in near silence, the cowboy setting posts and framing corners while Rosalind followed his curt instructions. Hold this, brace that, hand me the rope. He didn't make conversation, and she didn't try to force it. But slowly, the structure began to take shape. Real walls. A proper frame. Something that looked less like desperation and more like shelter. Around midday, he straightened and wiped his forehead. You got a name? Rosalind Vale. Wade Mercer. He nodded toward the south. I run the Triple M Ranch, about 4 miles that way. You need water. There's a creek on the northern edge of my land. I'll show you before I go. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This'll keep the rain off your head, but you've got no well, no garden, and winter's coming. You got a plan for that? Rosalind looked at the half-built shelter, at her bleeding hands, at the endless prairie stretching away in all directions. I'm working on it. Wade studied her for a moment, then pulled a canteen from the wagon and tossed it to her. Drink. You're no good to anyone if you pass out from heat. She caught it, unscrewed the cap, and took a long, grateful swallow. The water was warm but clean, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in days. When she handed it back, she met his eyes. Why are you really helping me? He hung the canteen back on the wagon and picked up another board. You remind me of someone. Who? My sister. He aligned the board and drove a nail with 3 efficient strikes. She died out here 10 years ago, childbirth. Her husband was off gambling in town when it happened. She was alone. Rosalind's throat tightened. I'm sorry. So am I, Wade said another nail. But she shouldn't have been alone. Nobody should. So if you're staying, you're doing it with decent walls and a roof that won't kill you. They finished the basic structure by sunset. 4 walls, a roof frame, a door that actually hung straight. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid. Wade loaded his tools back into the wagon and paused before climbing up to the seat. There's a position open at my ranch, he said, not quite looking at her. Cook and bookkeeper. Room and board plus wages. You'd be safe there. I have land here. Land doesn't mean much if you starve on it. I'll manage. Wade shook his head, but there was something almost like respect in his expression. You're a damn fool, Miss Vale. So I've been told. He climbed into the wagon, gathered the reins, then stopped. The offer stands. You change your mind, ride south till you see the Triple M brand. Can't miss it. I won't change my mind. Didn't think so. He clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward. But he called back over his shoulder, Creek's 2 miles south. Follow the cottonwoods. And Miss Vale? Yes? Lock your door at night. He drove off into the dusk, leaving Rosalind standing in front of her new shelter, small and rough and hers. She walked inside, ran her hand along the solid walls, and allowed herself a moment of something that felt dangerously close to hope. That night, she slept with a board braced against the door and woke to the sound of rain hammering on the roof. She lay in the darkness, listening to water drum against wood, waiting for leaks. But Wade Mercer had built well. The roof held. In the morning, she walked to the creek he'd mentioned and filled her canteen, then spent the day trying to figure out how to turn her $14 claim into something resembling a life. She inventoried the land, poor soil, sparse grass, a few struggling mesquites. She explored the ruins of the old barn and found rusted tools, a broken plow, and what might have been the start of a well shaft long since filled in with debris. She was digging through the barn wreckage when she found the strongbox. It was buried under a pile of rotted hay and fallen beams, a metal box with a broken lock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were papers, deeds, receipts, letters. She carried the box back to her shelter and spread the contents on the dirt floor, reading by the light that came through the gaps in the walls. Most of it was ordinary, records of cattle sales, supply orders, a few letters from a sister in Kansas. But near the bottom, she found something else. A survey map of the surrounding properties, marked with notes in faded ink. And according to that map, the Pritchard land included water rights to a spring that should have been about half a mile east of the house. Rosalind stared at the map, her heart beating faster. If there was really a spring, if it was still viable, that changed everything. She spent the next day searching, following the map's landmarks in her own stubborn hope. And late in the afternoon, in a shallow depression surrounded by scrub oak, she found it. Water, seeping up through sandy soil, not much more than a trickle but clear and cold. She knelt beside it, scooped up a handful, and tasted it. Sweet, clean, hers. She was still there, planning how to dig out a proper spring and line it with stones, when she heard riders approaching, 3 of them this time. She stood quickly, brushing dirt from her skirt, and watched them come. They were ranch hands, she guessed, young, rough-looking, with the casual arrogance of men who thought the prairie belonged to them. They reined in a few yards away and looked her over with expressions that made her skin crawl. "Well, well," the one in front said, grinning. "Heard there was a lady squatting on the Pritchard place. Didn't believe it till now." Rosalind kept her voice level. "I'm not squatting. I filed a legal claim." "That's so." The rider leaned forward in his saddle. "Lady alone out here, though. That's dangerous. All kinds of things could happen." "I'm fine, thank you." "Doesn't look fine to me." His grin widened. "Looks like you could use some company. Protection, maybe." "I don't need protection." "Sure about that?" One of the other riders spurred his horse closer, circling around her. "Pretty thing like you, all alone. Seems to me you should be friendlier to folks offering help." Rosalind's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her wrapped palms. She thought of Thomas Garrett's letter. She thought of Wade Mercer's warning. She thought of everything she'd survived to get here. "Get off my land," she said quietly. The lead rider laughed. "Your land? That's rich. Lady, this is open range. You might have some paper from town, but out here, she's got a legal claim." Wade Mercer's voice cut across the prairie like a whip crack. All 3 riders jerked around as he rode up on his gray horse, a rifle resting casually across his saddle. "And you boys are trespassing. Mr. Mercer," the lead rider's grin evaporated. "We were just leaving." Wade didn't raise the rifle, but his hand moved closer to it. "Weren't you?" The 3 ranch hands exchanged glances. Then, slowly, they turned their horses and rode north, one of them glancing back over his shoulder with a look that promised this wasn't over. Wade waited until they were out of sight, then dismounted and walked over to where Rosalind stood by the spring. "Dead. You find water?" "Yes." Her voice came out shakier than she wanted. "Good. You'll need it." He looked at her for a moment, and his expression softened just slightly. "Those were Drummond's men. He runs cattle on the land north of here, and he's been trying to buy up everything around him. He won't like you being here." "I gathered that." "Miss Vale." Wade's voice was serious now. "That offer I made still stands. Cook and bookkeeper at the Triple M. You'd be safe there." Rosalind thought about it, really thought about it this time. A real roof, regular meals, safety. It would be so easy to say yes, to let Wade Mercer solve her problems with his money and his guns and his protection. But she'd come to Texas because a man had promised to take care of her, and he'd broken that promise before she even stepped off the train. She'd spent her whole life letting other people define her future. Her father, her teachers, Thomas Garrett. And where had that gotten her? Here, bleeding into the boards, building something from nothing. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But no." Wade shook his head, but again there was that flicker of respect in his eyes. "Then let me give you something else. Come to the ranch tomorrow. I'll give you a rifle, show you how to shoot it, and I'll teach you what to watch for out here. Weather, trouble, danger. I can't pay. Call it an investment in my conscience." He swung back into the saddle. "Tomorrow, Miss Vale. Dawn. Don't make me regret this." He rode away before she could argue. Rosalind watched him go, then turned back to the spring. She knelt beside the water and pressed her wrapped, bleeding hands against the cool ground. She'd come to Texas with nothing but broken promises. But she was still here, still building, and she wasn't done yet. Rosalind arrived at the Triple M Ranch just as the sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. The ranch sprawled across a wide valley, more substantial than she'd imagined. A main house built of stone and timber, a massive barn, corrals filled with horses, and several outbuildings arranged in a neat semicircle. Smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney, and she could hear men's voices drifting across the yard, rough and joking in the early morning air. Wade was waiting for her by the barn, the rifle already in his hands. He nodded as she approached, his expression unreadable in the slanted light. "You came," he said. "You asked me to." Asking and expecting are different things. He held out the rifle. Winchester Model 1873. Holds 15 rounds. It's yours. Rosalind took it carefully, feeling the weight of the weapon in her hands. It was heavier than she'd expected, the metal cold against her palms, even through the bandages she still wore. Mr. Mercer, I can't accept. You can, and you will. His voice was firm. Out here, a gun isn't a luxury. It's survival. Now come on. We're burning daylight. He led her past the corrals to a stretch of open ground behind the barn where he'd set up targets. Old bottles lined up on fence posts, a few tin cans balanced on a barrel. The morning was still cool, but Rosalind could already feel sweat gathering at the small of her back as Wade showed her how to load the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. Don't close one eye, he said, adjusting her stance with impersonal efficiency. Keep both open, and breathe out slow when you pull the trigger. Don't jerk it. Squeeze. The first shot kicked harder than she'd expected, the recoil slamming into her shoulder and making her stumble backward. The bottle she'd aimed at remained untouched. Again, Wade said. She fired again and again. By the 10th shot, her shoulder ached and her ears rang, but one of the bottles had shattered, sending glass spinning into the dirt. Better, Wade said. He took the rifle and reloaded it with quick, practiced movements. But you're still tensing up before you fire. The gun knows when you're afraid of it. I'm not afraid. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose you are. He handed the rifle back. Keep practicing. 15 more rounds, then we'll talk about what else you need to know. By the time she'd emptied the rifle twice more, the sun was fully up, and ranch hands were beginning to drift toward the barn for morning work. They stopped when they saw her, a woman in a dusty dress holding a Winchester, and she could feel their eyes on her back. Some looked curious. Others looked skeptical. One laughed and said something to his companion that she couldn't quite hear, but could guess at easily enough. Wade's voice cut across the yard. Something funny, Dawson? The laughter died. No, sir, Mr. Mercer. Then get to work. The hands scattered, but Rosalind could still feel their attention like a weight between her shoulder blades. Wade noticed her discomfort and shook his head. They'll test you, he said. It's what men do when they see something they don't understand. You want respect out here? You earn it the same way they did, by proving you're worth it. And how do I do that? By not breaking. He walked toward the main house, gesturing for her to follow. Come on, there's someone you should meet. The house was larger inside than it looked from the outside, with high ceilings and wide windows that let in the morning light. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was meticulously clean. Wade led her through to a spacious office lined with books and filing cabinets, where a scarred oak desk sat buried under stacks of ledgers and loose papers. This is the problem, Wade said, gesturing at the chaos. I can run cattle and manage men, but numbers make my head hurt. Had a bookkeeper until 2 months ago, but he took off for the silver mines in Colorado. Since then, it's been... He waved a hand at the mess. This. Rosalind set the rifle carefully against the wall and moved closer to the desk. She picked up one of the ledgers and flipped it open. The entries were cramped and hasty, some crossed out, others trailing off mid-calculation. She turned a few more pages, her trained eye catching errors almost immediately. Transposed numbers, forgotten columns, entire pages that didn't balance. May I? She asked, gesturing to the desk chair. Wade nodded, watching her with those creekwater eyes as she sat down and began sorting through the papers. She'd kept books for her father's dry goods store back in St. Louis from the time she was 14 until she'd left for Texas. Numbers made sense to her in a way that people often didn't. Clean, orderly, honest. They told the truth if you knew how to read them. She worked in silence for several minutes, organizing papers into stacks, opening ledgers, tracing entries with her bandaged finger. Wade stood by the window, his arms crossed, not interrupting. Finally, she looked up. Your last bookkeeper was either incompetent or stealing from you, she said quietly. Probably both. Wade's jaw tightened. Explain. These supply orders. She tapped a page. You're being charged for 200 pounds of feed grain, but your inventory records show only 150 received. That's 50 pounds missing, and it's not just once, it happens on almost every order. Small amounts, easy to miss if you're not looking carefully. How much total? Rosalind did the math in her head. If this pattern holds across all the ledgers, I'd estimate you've lost somewhere between $500 and $800 in the last 6 months. Wade's expression went very still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. $800. It could be more. I'd need time to go through everything properly. She met his eyes. Mr. Mercer, this isn't just carelessness. Someone was deliberately falsifying your records, and if your bookkeeper left town 2 months ago, he knew I'd figure it out eventually. Wade's voice was flat, controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. That son of a bitch. There's more. Rosalind turned to another ledger. Your payroll records show you have 18 ranch hands on salary, but I saw maybe 12 men outside. Where are the other 6? There aren't any other 6. Then someone's been collecting wages for workers who don't exist. She showed him the entries. $300 a month paid out regularly for the last 4 months. $1,200 total, just in ghost wages. Wade leaned over the desk, his hands flat on the wood, and stared at the numbers as if he could make them change through sheer force of will. Then he straightened, walked to the window, and stood there for a long moment, looking out at his ranch. Can you fix it? He asked finally. I can organize it, track where the money went, find the discrepancies, create a system to prevent it from happening again. But, Mr. Mercer, whoever helped your bookkeeper steal from you might still be here. If I start asking questions, let them come. His voice was quiet, dangerous. I want to know who stabbed me in the back, and I want my books clean. He turned to face her. The job is yours if you want it. Cook quit last week anyway, said the men were too rough and the hours too long. You can handle both positions, room and board, in this main house, $40 a month, plus you keep the rifle. You work the books, manage the kitchen, and you're under my protection. Anyone bothers you, they answer to me. Rosalind looked at the ledgers, at the chaos that needed untangling, at the numbers that would tell her exactly who had betrayed this hard-eyed rancher who'd shown her more kindness than anyone else in Texas. She thought of her little shelter on the Pritchard land, of the spring she'd found, of the claim she'd paid $14 to make her own. I keep my homestead, she said. Wade blinked. What? I'll work for you, Mr. Mercer. I'll clean your books and cook your meals. But I'm not giving up my land. I'll need time to maintain it, Sundays, at minimum. And if there's an emergency, if something threatens my claim, I need to be able to go. He studied her for a long moment, and she thought he might refuse, might tell her she was being foolish, might withdraw the offer entirely. Instead, he nodded slowly. Fair enough. You work 6 days, you get Sundays. And if your land needs you, we'll figure it out. He held out his hand. Deal? Rosalind shook it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. Deal. Good. You start now. Kitchen's through there. He gestured toward a doorway. And the hands expect breakfast in 30 minutes. Think you can manage that? She thought of the bare pantry in her shelter, of the meals she'd been stretching from almost nothing. I'll manage. That's what I figured. Wade almost smiled. And Miss Vale? Welcome to the Triple M. The kitchen was better equipped than she'd dared hope. A massive iron stove, shelves stocked with flour and salt and preserved goods, a larder filled with smoked meat, and fresh eggs and butter kept cool in a stone cellar. Rosalind tied on an apron and got to work, her hands moving through familiar motions even as her mind spun with everything that had just happened. She fried bacon and eggs, made biscuits from scratch, brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint. By the time the ranch hands filed into the dining hall, a long room attached to the kitchen with a table that could seat 20, she had platters of food waiting. The men came in loud and hungry, their conversation dying when they saw her standing by the stove. For a moment, there was silence. Then Wade walked in behind them, his presence filling the doorway. This is Miss Vale, he said. She's your new cook and bookkeeper. You'll treat her with respect, or you'll answer to me. Understood? A chorus of yes, sir followed, some more reluctant than others. The men sat, and Rosalind began serving, moving down the table with platters and a coffee pot. She felt their eyes on her, assessing, judging, waiting for her to prove herself or fail. One of the younger hands, a sandy-haired boy who couldn't have been more than 19, smiled shyly as she filled his plate. Thank you, ma'am. Smells real good. You're welcome, she said. An older man farther down the table, his face weathered as old leather, grunted as he bit into a biscuit. Better than what we've been eating, that's for damn sure. Language, Curtis, Wade said mildly from the head of the table. Sorry, boss. Curtis didn't look particularly sorry, but he nodded to Rosalind. Good cooking, though. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Rosalind finished serving and retreated to the kitchen, listening to the sounds of eating and conversation through the doorway. She washed dishes in a basin of hot water, her bandaged hands stinging, and tried not to think too hard about what she'd just agreed to. After breakfast, Wade found her in the office, already deep in the ledgers. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her work for a moment before speaking. You need anything, you let me know, he said. I need the names of your suppliers, Rosalind said without looking up, and anyone who had access to these books before I got here. I'll get you a list. He paused. Miss Vale, what you found this morning, I appreciate it. Not many people would have caught that. Numbers don't lie, Mr. Mercer. People do. That they do. He straightened. I've got work to handle. You need me? I'll be with the horses. She worked through the morning, building a picture of the ranch's finances transaction by transaction. The theft was systematic, clever, spread across enough categories that it might have gone unnoticed for years if someone wasn't looking carefully. But Rosalind was looking very carefully indeed, and the more she found, the angrier she became, not just at the theft, but at the casual assumption that no one would notice, that Wade Mercer was too busy or too trusting to check his own books. By noon, she had a list of discrepancies that ran 3 pages long. She was double-checking a supplier invoice when she heard raised voices from outside. She set down her pen and moved to the window, looking out onto the ranch yard. 2 men on horseback had ridden up to the main house, and Wade was walking out to meet them. One of the riders was a heavy-set man in an expensive suit, his face red with heat or anger or both. The other was thinner, harder, with a gun belt slung low on his hips. Rosalind couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could read body language well enough. The heavy man was angry, gesturing sharply. Wade stood with his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. The exchange grew more heated, the heavy man leaning down from his saddle to shout something directly into Wade's face. Wade didn't flinch. He said something short and sharp, and the heavy man's face went from red to purple. Then Wade turned his back and walked toward the house, dismissing them entirely. The thin man's hand drifted toward his gun. Rosalind didn't think. She grabbed the Winchester from where she'd left it by the desk, threw open the window, and called out, Mr. Mercer? Wade turned. So did both riders. And they all saw her standing in the window with the rifle in her hands, not quite aimed at anyone, but not quite aimed at nothing either. The thin man's hand moved away from his gun. The heavy man stared at her, his expression cycling through shock and fury before settling on something that looked like grudging calculation. Then he wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the gate, his companion following. They didn't look back. Wade walked into the office a moment later, his expression carefully neutral. You know how to use that thing yet? Well enough to make someone think twice. Rosalind set the rifle down, her hands shaking now that the moment had passed. Who was that? Frank Drummond. Owns the land north of here. Wade's voice was tight. He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years. Doesn't like taking no for an answer. The man with him looked like a hired gun. That's because he is. Drummond keeps 3 of them on payroll. Wade moved to the window and looked out at the empty yard. He wanted to know why I was harboring you. Said you had no business squatting on the Pritchard place, that it was driving down property values. That's absurd. The land was abandoned. Doesn't matter to Drummond. He wanted that claim to stay empty so he could eventually buy it up cheap. Now you've filed, and it's worth what you paid for it, which means he can't just swoop in and take it. Wade turned to look at her. He also said if you don't clear out in 3 days, he'll have you removed. He can try. Miss Vale. Wade's voice was serious. Drummond doesn't make empty threats. If he says he'll remove you, he means it, and he's got the men and the money to do it. Rosalind thought of her shelter, of the spring she'd found, of every piece of herself she'd poured into that $14 claim. Then I'll fight him. With what? A rifle you learned to shoot this morning? With the law. She gestured to the ledgers on the desk. You said he's been trying to buy you out. Has he made offers in writing? Some of them. Do you still have the letters? Wade's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if Frank Drummond is desperate enough to threaten a woman over a worthless piece of land, he's probably desperate for a reason, and desperate men make mistakes. She met his gaze. Let me see everything you have on him. Every letter, every offer, every interaction. If he's planning something, there'll be a trail. Wade studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll get you the files. But Miss Vale, if you're going to war with Frank Drummond, you'd better be ready for him to hit back. And he fights dirty. So do I, Rosalind said quietly. I just do it with numbers. The files Wade brought her that afternoon were thick with correspondence, offers to buy the Triple M, increasingly aggressive demands that Wade sell, thinly veiled threats about what might happen if he continued to refuse. Rosalind read through them methodically, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might give her leverage. What she found was worse than simple intimidation. Buried in a letter from 8 months ago, Drummond had made a specific reference to the Triple M's financial difficulties, mentioning recent losses that Wade should consider before rejecting such a generous offer. But according to the ranch's books, there had been no unusual losses 8 months ago. The theft hadn't started until 6 months back, which meant either Drummond was guessing or he'd had inside information, or he'd arranged for the losses himself. Rosalind sat back in her chair, her mind racing. If Drummond had planted someone in the Triple M to sabotage Wade's finances, to create the appearance of a failing ranch that would have to be sold, that was conspiracy. That was fraud. And if she could prove it, she could destroy him. She was still working through the implications when the kitchen door slammed open and one of the ranch hands burst in, his face pale. Miss Vale, where's Mr. Mercer? With the horses. What's wrong? Storm coming. Bad one. And your place is right in its path. Rosalind's blood went cold. She looked out the window and saw it. A wall of black clouds rolling in from the west, lightning flickering in their depths like trapped fire. The wind had already picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the yard. How long? She asked. Hour, maybe less. Mr. Mercer said to tell you, but Rosalind was already moving, grabbing the rifle, her shawl, running for the door. Wade met her in the yard, already saddling a horse. You're not going out there, he said. It's my land. It's a death trap in a storm like this. That shelter won't hold. Then I'll make it hold. She reached for the saddle, but Wade caught her arm. Rosalind. It was the first time he'd used her given name. I built that shelter in a day with scrap lumber. It's not going to survive what's coming. Stay here, please. She looked at the approaching storm, at the concern in Wade's eyes, at the safe, solid ranch house behind her. Then she thought of the spring she'd found, the claim she'd filed, the future she'd started to build from nothing. I have to try, she said. Wade's jaw tightened, but he released her arm and finished saddling the horse. Then I'm coming with you. You don't have to... The hell I don't. He swung into the saddle and pulled her up behind him. Hold on. They rode hard across the prairie, the wind whipping at their clothes, the first fat drops of rain already falling. By the time they reached the Pritchard place, the storm was nearly on top of them. Thunder rolling across the sky like artillery, lightning turning the world white and black in stuttering flashes. The shelter was still standing, but barely. The wind had already torn away part of the roof, and the walls were shaking with each gust. Rosalind jumped down from the horse and ran inside, grabbing the few possessions she'd left there, her spare dress, her books, the strongbox with the old survey maps. Forget that, Wade shouted over the wind. We need to go. Not without these. She stuffed everything into her carpet bag and was heading for the door when the first real gust hit. The whole structure shuddered, groaned, and then the north wall simply folded inward, boards snapping like kindling. Wade grabbed her and pulled her out into the storm. Rain was falling in sheets now, soaking them both in seconds. He pushed her toward his horse, but before they could mount, a sound like a freight train filled the air. Rosalind looked up and saw it. A funnel cloud, black and terrible, dropping from the sky about a mile to the west. Cellar! Wade shouted. The old house! There has to be a cellar! They ran for the ruins of the main house, Wade half dragging her across ground that had turned to mud. Behind them, she heard her shelter collapse completely, The crash of wood drowned out by the roar of the approaching tornado. Wade found the cellar door buried under debris and hauled it open. Stone steps led down into darkness. He shoved her inside and followed, pulling the door shut above them just as the tornado hit. The world became noise, a howling, shrieking chaos that felt like it would tear the earth itself apart. Rosalind huddled on the stone floor, her hands over her ears, feeling the pressure change make her ears pop. Wade's arm was around her shoulders, holding her steady, his body between her and the cellar door as if he could shield her from the storm through sheer force of will. It lasted forever. It lasted minutes. When the sound finally began to fade, Rosalind realized she was shaking, her breath coming in gasps. Wade's voice came out of the darkness, rough and close. "You hurt?" "No, you?" "I'm fine." He released her and moved to the cellar door, pushing it open carefully. Gray light filtered down. "Come on, let's see what's left." What was left was devastation. The tornado had carved a path of destruction across the Pritchard land, tearing up scrub grass and mesquite, scattering debris across the prairie. Rosalind's shelter was simply gone, obliterated, reduced to splinters and scattered nails. Even the shed she'd first sheltered in had been flattened, but the spring was still there, water still seeping clear and cold from the ground. Rosalind stood in the rain. It was falling gently now, the storm's fury spent, and looked at the wreckage of everything she'd built. She should have felt despair, she should have felt defeat. Instead, she felt something hard and bright and furious settle in her chest. "I'm not done," she said aloud. Wade stood beside her, rain dripping from his hat brim. "No one would blame you if you were." "I would." She turned to face him, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Mr. Mercer, I came to Texas because a man promised me a future and then took it away before I even got off the train. I claimed this land because I was too stubborn to quit, and I built that shelter with my own bleeding hands because I needed to prove I could. And now it's gone. Rosalind, but the land is still here. The spring is still here. And I am still here." She met his eyes. "So I'm going to work for you, and I'm going to clean your books, and I'm going to help you figure out who's stealing from you. And then I'm going to come back to my land, and I'm going to build something that a tornado can't tear down, because I am not done." Wade looked at her for a long moment, water running down his face, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Then let's get to work." They rode back to the Triple M in silence, both soaked to the bone. The horse picking its way carefully across ground turned treacherous with mud. Rosalind's carpetbag was clutched against her chest, heavy with water, and she could feel Wade's tension in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he guided the horse around debris scattered by the storm. When they finally reached the ranch, Curtis was waiting by the barn, his weathered face tight with concern. "Boss, we lost part of the north fence and 2 head of cattle. Found them down in the wash. And the cookhouse took some damage. Roof's got a hole you could drive a wagon through." Wade dismounted and helped Rosalind down. "Anyone hurt?" "No, sir. Everyone made it to shelter in time." Curtis's eyes flicked to Rosalind, then back to Wade. "Your place make it, ma'am?" "No," Rosalind said simply. "It's gone." Curtis grimaced but didn't offer false sympathy, which she appreciated. "Well, you got a room here now. That's something." Wade showed her to a small bedroom on the second floor of the main house, simply furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the prairie. He left her there with dry clothes borrowed from somewhere, a simple dress that was too big in the shoulders but would do, and instructions to rest. But Rosalind had no intention of resting. As soon as she'd changed and wrung the water from her hair, she went straight back to the office and the ledgers waiting there. The numbers were a refuge, clean and orderly, in a world that had just proven itself capable of tearing everything apart in minutes. She worked through the afternoon while the ranch hands repaired storm damage outside, her pen scratching across paper as she traced the flow of money through Wade's accounts. The theft was even more extensive than she'd first calculated. Someone had been systematically bleeding the Triple M for at least 8 months, maybe longer. And the timing of it, starting just after Drummond's first serious offer to buy the ranch, was too convenient to be coincidence. She was deep in a stack of supply invoices when she heard boots on the stairs. Wade appeared in the doorway, his shirt still damp, his hair pushed back from his face. You should be resting, he said. I've rested enough. She held up an invoice. Mr. Mercer, do you know a man named Simon Vance? Wade's expression darkened. He's the foreman. Why? Because his signature is on most of these falsified supply orders. He approved payments for goods that were never delivered, signed off on inventory that doesn't exist, and countersigned the payroll records with the ghost workers. She set the invoice down and met Wade's eyes. Your foreman has been stealing from you, and I'd bet everything I own that Frank Drummond put him up to it. Wade was very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that preceded an explosion. Then he turned and walked to the window, his hands braced against the frame. Simon's worked for me for 3 years, came recommended, worked hard, never gave me reason to doubt him. That's what makes him perfect for this kind of operation. He had your trust, he had access, and he was smart enough to spread the theft across enough categories that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Where is he now? I haven't seen him since breakfast. Rosalind stood and moved to stand beside Wade. Mr. Mercer, if he realizes I'm going through the books, if he knows I've found the discrepancies, he'll run. Wade's voice was flat, hard. Or worse. He turned to face her. Stay in the house tonight. Lock your door. I'm going to have a conversation with Simon Vance, and I want you somewhere safe when I do. What are you going to do? Ask him some questions, and depending on his answers, either give him a chance to make this right or run him off my land. Wade's jaw was tight. Either way, this ends tonight. But it didn't end that night, because when Wade went looking for Simon Vance, the foreman was nowhere to be found. His bunk in the workers' quarters was empty, his belongings gone. He'd taken a horse from the stable and ridden out sometime during the storm, and no one had seen him leave. He knew, Wade said when he came back to report. His anger was cold now, controlled, more dangerous for being leashed. Someone tipped him off. Rosalind thought of the ranch hands at breakfast, the way some had watched her with calculation in their eyes. Do you trust your men? I thought I did. Now I don't know who else might be working with Vance. Wade pulled out a chair and sat heavily. This is a mess, Rosalind. If word gets out that my own foreman was stealing from me, that I didn't catch it for months, then we make sure it doesn't get out until we have proof of everything, not just Vance's theft, but Drummond's involvement. She pulled her notes toward her. I found a pattern in the payments. Every time Vance authorized a false invoice, the money was supposed to go to different suppliers. But look at the bank routing numbers. They're all the same. Someone set up a single account to collect all the stolen funds, and I'd bet my claim that account leads straight back to Drummond. Wade leaned forward, studying the numbers she'd circled. Can you prove it? I can prove the money went somewhere it wasn't supposed to, but to prove where it actually ended up, I'd need access to bank records, and they won't hand those over without a court order. Then we get a court order. Based on what? Suspicion? The bank won't open their books on a hunch, and Drummond has friends in town. The judge, the sheriff, half of them are probably in his pocket. Rosalind tapped the ledger thoughtfully. We need something more. Something that directly links Vance to Drummond. Something that proves conspiracy. Like a letter? A payment record? Exactly. If Vance and Drummond were working together, there has to be correspondence, agreements, some kind of paper trail. And if Vance ran, he might have left evidence behind. Wade stood abruptly. His quarters. If there's anything, it'll be there. Come on. They searched Vance's bunk by lamplight, going through the few possessions he'd left behind. Old clothes, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, a deck of cards. Wade checked under the mattress while Rosalind examined the small trunk at the foot of the bed. Most of it was unremarkable, but tucked into the bottom, wrapped in an old shirt, she found a leather portfolio. Inside were letters. The first few were innocuous, notes from family, a few business receipts, but near the back, she found what she was looking for. A letter on expensive stationery, dated 4 months earlier, signed with a large, aggressive scrawl, Frank Drummond. Rosalind read it aloud, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. Vance, the arrangements we discussed are proceeding as planned. Continue to create the appearance of financial difficulty, and I will ensure your compensation is generous when the property transfers. Remember, subtlety is essential. Mercer must believe the ranch is failing on its own. Once he's desperate enough, he'll sell, and we'll both profit. Destroy this letter after reading. Wade's face had gone pale, then red. the veins standing out in his neck. That bastard. That conniving, backstabbing bastard. This is proof, Rosalind said, holding the letter carefully. This is conspiracy to commit fraud. With this, we can destroy him. Wade took the letter, read it again, his hands shaking slightly. I'm going to Drummond's ranch right now. I'm going to shove this letter down his throat and then… No! Rosalind caught his arm. Mr. Mercer, if you go there angry, if you confront him without a plan, he'll just deny everything. He'll say the letter is a forgery, that Vance acted alone. And if you lay a hand on him, you'll be the one who ends up in jail. I don't care. Yes, you do, because going to jail means losing the ranch, which is exactly what Drummond wants. She kept her voice calm, reasonable, even though her own anger was a living thing clawing at her ribs. We do this the right way. We take this letter to the sheriff, we file a complaint, we force an investigation. We make Drummond answer for this in court, where everyone can see what he did. Wade stared at her, his jaw working, the muscles in his arms tense under her hand. Then slowly, the fury in his eyes banked down to something colder, more controlled. You're right. But Rosalind, if the sheriff is in Drummond's pocket, then we go over his head. We take this to the circuit judge when he comes through next month. We make so much noise that Drummond can't silence it. She held up the letter. This is evidence, Mr. Mercer. This is power. We use it smart, or we waste it. Wade took a long breath, then nodded. All right, we do it your way. But I want that son of a bitch to pay for every dollar he stole, every lie he told. He will, Rosalind said quietly. I promise you, he will. They were walking back to the main house when Curtis intercepted them, his expression grim. Boss, you got a visitor. Says it's urgent. Who? Thomas Garrett. The name hit Rosalind like a physical blow. She stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat. Wade looked at her sharply. Who's Thomas Garrett? The man who brought me to Texas, Rosalind said, her voice tight. The one who sent me a letter telling me he'd married someone else. Wade's eyes went hard. You want me to send him away? Everything in Rosalind wanted to say yes, to hide in the house and let Wade deal with the man who'd broken his promises before she'd even stepped off the train. But she'd survived a tornado, uncovered a conspiracy, and claimed a life from nothing. She wasn't going to run from Thomas Garrett now. No, she said, I'll see him. Thomas was waiting in the front parlor, hat in hand, looking exactly as she remembered, handsome in a soft, forgettable way, with sandy hair and pale eyes, and the kind of weak chin that a beard couldn't quite hide. He stood when she entered, his expression carefully arranged into something that might have been contrition. Rosalind, he said, thank heaven. I heard you were here, and I had to see for myself that you were all right. She stayed near the door, Wade a solid presence at her shoulder. What do you want, Thomas? I wanted to apologize. What I did, how I treated you, it was unforgivable. Catherine and it was a mistake. I realize that now. How convenient for you to realize it now. Rosalind's voice was ice. What changed, Thomas? Did Miss Holbrook's father discover you weren't as wealthy as you claimed? Did her family refuse the match? Thomas's face flushed. It's more complicated than that. I'm sure it is, but it doesn't concern me anymore. She started to turn away. Wait! Thomas took a step forward, and Wade shifted almost imperceptibly, putting himself more fully between them. Thomas stopped, swallowed, and continued in a rush. Rosalind, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But we can fix this. You can come back to town, stay at my family's home until we arrange the wedding. I spoke to the minister already. He can marry us next week. The sheer audacity of it left Rosalind momentarily speechless. When she finally found her voice, it was shaking with suppressed fury. You think I would marry you after what you did? I know I hurt you, but you didn't hurt me, Thomas. You freed me. She stepped closer, her hands clenched at her sides. You freed me from the fantasy that you were a man of honor. You freed me from a future spent depending on someone who abandons commitments the moment they become inconvenient. So no, I will not come back to town with you. I will not marry you. I have work here, a life here, and a homestead claim that's worth more to me than any promise you could make." Thomas's expression shifted from contrition to irritation. "A homestead claim? Rosalind, be reasonable. You can't possibly think you can survive out here alone. A woman needs protection, a home." "I have both," Wade said quietly. His voice was conversational, but there was steel underneath. "Miss Vale works for me. She has a room in this house and my protection. So whatever you came here to say, you've said it. Now leave." "And who are you?" Thomas bristled. "Her employer? You don't have the right to touch." "I have every right. This is my land, my house. You're here because I'm allowing it, and I can just as easily have you thrown off the property." Wade's hand rested casually near his gun. "Miss Vale has made her feelings clear. Time for you to go." Thomas looked between them, his face reddening further. "This is absurd. Rosalind, people in town are talking. They're saying you're living in sin, working for this rancher, that I'm what?" Rosalind's voice cut across his. "Ruined, improper. Thomas, I don't care what people in town say about me. I stopped caring about their opinions the moment I stepped off that train and realized the only person I could depend on was myself." "You're making a mistake." Thomas's tone had turned sullen now, petulant. "You think you can survive out here, but you can't. Women like me built this country while men like you were writing empty promises on expensive paper." Rosalind moved to the door and opened it. "Goodbye, Thomas. Don't come back." He stared at her for a long moment, his mouth working as if he wanted to say more. Then he grabbed his hat and stalked out, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Rosalind watched him mount his horse and ride away, and only when he was out of sight did she close the door and lean against it, her whole body trembling. Wade stood nearby, giving her space, but ready to catch her if she fell. "You all right?" "I will be." She took a shaky breath. I can't believe he actually thought I would go back to him, that I would just forgive everything, and..." She broke off, shaking her head. "Men like that always think they'll be forgiven," Wade said quietly. "They can't imagine a world where their actions have permanent consequences. But you handled him exactly right." "Did I?" Rosalind pushed away from the door. "Because now people in town are talking about me, and if Thomas is spreading rumors, let them talk. Anyone who knows you knows the truth." Wade's expression softened slightly. "And anyone who doesn't know you isn't worth your concern." Rosalind wanted to believe that, but she'd lived in enough small towns to know how gossip worked, how reputations could be destroyed by whispers and innuendo. Still, there was nothing she could do about it now. She had larger problems to face. The next morning, those problems arrived in the form of a legal summons. Curtis brought it in with the mail, his expression troubled. "This just came for you, Miss Vale. Looks official." Rosalind took the envelope, saw the seal of the county court, and felt her stomach drop. She opened it with fingers that wanted to shake and read the contents twice before the words fully registered. Thomas Garrett was suing her. The complaint was filed under some archaic breach of promise statute, claiming that she had agreed to marry him via written correspondence, that she had induced him to make financial arrangements on her behalf, and that her subsequent refusal to honor their agreement had caused him significant damages. He was demanding compensation, claiming injury to his reputation, and asking the court to compel her to either fulfill the marriage contract or pay him $500. $500, Rosalind said aloud, her voice hollow. "He wants $500. Wade read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with each line. "This is extortion. He can't possibly. He can try. And even if the court doesn't award him anything, I'll have to defend myself. I'll have to stand up in front of the whole town and have my private correspondence read aloud, my decisions questioned, my reputation..." She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "We'll fight this." Wade's voice was firm. "We'll get a lawyer. With what money?" Rosalind looked up at him. "Mr. Mercer, I have $29 to my name and a homestead claim that was just destroyed by a tornado. I can't afford a lawyer. And even if I could, Thomas knows people in town. The judge, the sheriff. His family has connections. I'd be walking into that courtroom alone, with no one to speak for me, and..." "You won't be alone." Wade took the summons from her hands. "I'll speak for you. I'll testify about your character, your work here, everything you've done. And we'll bring evidence, the letters he sent you, proof that he's the one who broke the engagement, not you. You'd do that? Risk your reputation for someone who saved my ranch from bankruptcy and fraud. For someone who's shown more courage in 3 weeks than most people show in a lifetime. Wade's eyes were fierce. Yes, Rosalind, I'd do that. She wanted to cry, wanted to rage, wanted to do something other than stand there with a legal summons in her hands and feel the weight of Thomas Garrett's vindictiveness crushing down on her. But crying wouldn't help, and rage wouldn't change the facts. So instead, she straightened her shoulders and said, Then we'd better prepare. If I'm going to defend myself in court, I need to know every argument he might make and have an answer ready. They spent the next week preparing, Rosalind working through her correspondence with Thomas, documenting every promise he'd made and broken, every instance where he'd misrepresented his intentions. Wade hired a lawyer from 2 towns over, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen who specialized in contract disputes and had no love for men who manipulated legal systems to punish women who refused them. This is a nuisance suit, Margaret said after reviewing the case. He's using the court to harass you because he's embarrassed that you rejected him. But we can beat this. You have his letters admitting he broke the engagement. You have witnesses who can testify to your character. And most importantly, you have the fact that he married someone else before you even arrived in Texas. No court is going to compel you to marry a man who's already married. He's not married anymore, Rosalind said quietly. I heard from someone in town. Miss Holbrook's family called off the engagement a week after Thomas sent me that letter. That's why he's doing this now. He's alone, he's embarrassed, and he wants to make me pay for refusing him. Margaret's expression hardened. Then we make him regret ever filing this suit. We don't just defend you, Rosalind. We go on the offensive. We show the court exactly what kind of man Thomas Garrett is, and we make sure everyone in that town knows he's the villain in this story, not you. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out, and in the meantime, life at the Triple M continued. Rosalind cooked, kept the books, and slowly earned the grudging respect of ranch hands who'd initially seen her as nothing more than an inconvenience. The young sandy-haired cowboy, whose name turned out to be Danny, started bringing her wildflowers from the prairie. Curtis taught her how to shoot better, setting up targets behind the barn and coaching her until she could hit a bottle at 50 yards more often than not. Even the skeptical ones began to nod to her in the mornings, to thank her for meals, to ask her advice on small matters. Wade noticed. One evening, as she was finishing the dishes after dinner, he leaned against the kitchen door frame and said, They respect you now. Some of them, Rosalind said, scrubbing a pot. More than some. Curtis told me yesterday that you're the best shot among the new hands, and Danny's been telling everyone who'll listen that your biscuits are better than his mother's. Wade smiled slightly. You've proven yourself, Rosalind. They see it. I'm glad someone does. She set the pot aside to dry. Mr. Mercer, about the hearing, we're ready. Margaret's ready. You're going to walk into that courtroom and show Thomas Garrett and everyone else exactly what you're made of. He straightened. And when it's over, we're going to deal with Frank Drummond. Between your testimony about the financial fraud and the letter we found from Vance, we'll have enough to file charges. We take them both down. Rosalind nodded, but doubt still gnawed at her. She'd spent weeks preparing her defense, marshaling evidence, rehearsing arguments. But standing in a courtroom and facing Thomas, knowing the whole town would be watching, judging, it terrified her in a way that tornadoes and threatening ranch hands never had. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her room, the lamp burning low, going over her notes one more time. There was a soft knock on her door, and when she opened it, Wade was standing there with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this, so," he said, offering her one. She took it gratefully and sat on the edge of the bed while Wade leaned against the dresser. They drank in comfortable silence for a moment before he spoke. "My sister, the one I told you about. Her name was Anne. She was smarter than me, tougher than me, and she had dreams about building something out here. A real home, a family. She married a man she thought would help her build that dream, but he was weak, selfish. When she needed him most, he wasn't there." Rosalind looked up at him, seeing the old grief in his eyes. "I was away when she died," Wade continued quietly, "buying cattle in San Antonio. By the time I got back, she'd been buried 2 days. and her husband had already left, couldn't stand the guilt of it. I swore then that I'd never let someone suffer alone like that again, not if I could help it. He met her eyes. That's why I helped you, Rosalind, and that's why I'll be sitting right behind you tomorrow, no matter what Thomas Garrett says, no matter what the town thinks. You won't be alone. Thank you, Rosalind said, her voice rough. For everything. Wade nodded, set down his empty cup, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. You're going to win tomorrow. Not because you have the better lawyer or the stronger case, though you have both. You're going to win because you're the kind of woman who builds shelters in storms and fights back when the world tries to break her. Thomas Garrett doesn't stand a chance against that. The courtroom was packed when they arrived the next morning. It seemed like half the town had turned out to watch the spectacle. Faces Rosalind didn't recognize filling the benches, whispering behind hands and staring at her with undisguised curiosity. Thomas sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a portly man in an expensive suit who looked pleased with himself. When Thomas saw Rosalind enter with Wade and Margaret, his expression flickered between satisfaction and something that might have been shame before settling back into injured dignity. The judge, a gray-haired man named Halloran, called the court to order and gestured for both parties to approach. Margaret went first, laying out the defense in clear, precise language. She presented Thomas's letters, read aloud his own words breaking the engagement, and pointed out that he had, in fact, married another woman shortly after abandoning Rosalind. Thomas's lawyer objected, claiming that the subsequent failed engagement was irrelevant, that the breach of promise had occurred when Rosalind refused Thomas's renewed offer of marriage. Margaret countered that there had been no valid contract to breach, as Thomas had voided any agreement when he chose another bride. Then it was Thomas's turn to testify. He took the stand looking somber and wounded, painting himself as a man who'd made a mistake in a moment of confusion, who'd tried to make amends, who'd offered Rosalind every opportunity to salvage her reputation and future. His lawyer asked leading questions designed to make Rosalind sound unreasonable, demanding, unwilling to forgive an honest error. And when you offered to marry Miss Vale after your previous engagement ended, what did she say? The lawyer asked. She refused, Thomas said, his voice heavy with regret. She said she had work at a ranch, that she'd claimed a homestead. I tried to explain that a woman alone in such circumstances would face scandal, that I was offering her a respectable alternative, but she wouldn't listen. Did she seem angry? Extremely, almost irrational. I worried for her well-being, frankly. Margaret rose smoothly. Objection. The witness is speculating about Miss Vale's mental state. Sustained, Judge Halloran said. Stick to facts, Mr. Garrett. But the damage was done. Rosalind could see it in the faces of the spectators, the knowing looks, the whispers. They believed him, or at least they wanted to believe him, because it was easier to believe that a woman scorned had become unreasonable than to admit that one of their own had behaved dishonorably. Then Margaret called Rosalind to the stand. She walked to the witness box on legs that felt like water, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Margaret started with gentle questions. When had she first corresponded with Thomas? What had he promised her? What had she given up to come to Texas? Rosalind answered carefully, keeping her voice steady, sticking to the facts. Then Margaret produced the letters. Miss Vale, is this the letter you received from Mr. Garrett upon your arrival in Cassidy Junction? Yes. Would you read it for the court, please? Rosalind took the paper, her hands trembling slightly, and read aloud. Miss Vale, circumstances have changed since our correspondence began. I have entered into an engagement with Miss Catherine Holbrook of San Antonio. I trust you will find your own arrangements. T. Garrett. There was a stirring in the courtroom, whispers that Judge Halloran had to gavel into silence. And did you in fact find your own arrangements? Margaret asked. I filed a homestead claim. I began building a shelter, and when Mr. Mercer offered me employment, I accepted. Did Mr. Garrett offer you any assistance when you arrived? Any apology? Any explanation? No, I received only that letter. Margaret turned to face Thomas. And yet, weeks later, after you learned Miss Vale was successfully employed and had claimed land, you suddenly wanted to marry her again. Why the change of heart, Mr. Garrett? Thomas's lawyer objected, but Judge Halloran allowed the question. Thomas shifted in his seat, his face reddening. I realized I'd made a mistake. I wanted to make it right. Or, Margaret said coolly, "You realized that Miss Vale was doing quite well without you, and you couldn't tolerate that. So you decided to use the courts to punish her for refusing to forgive you. That's not— You're asking this court to award you $500 from a woman you abandoned without warning, without assistance, in a town where she knew no one. A woman who has since proven herself more than capable of surviving without you." Margaret's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "This isn't about breach of promise, Your Honor. This is about a man's wounded pride." The courtroom erupted in noise. Judge Halloran hammered his gavel repeatedly until silence returned. "Closing arguments," he said curtly. Both lawyers presented their cases. Thomas's attorney painted Rosalind as a woman who'd led his client on, who'd accepted his affections and then spurned him publicly. Margaret presented the facts: the abandonment, the broken promises, the subsequent harassment disguised as reconciliation. Then Wade took the stand as a character witness. He spoke plainly about finding Rosalind building a shelter with bleeding hands, about hiring her and discovering her competence with numbers, about the financial fraud she'd uncovered that had saved his ranch. And when Thomas's lawyer tried to imply impropriety in their working relationship, Wade looked the man dead in the eye and said, "Miss Vale is the most honorable person I've ever met. She works harder than any three of my ranch hands combined. She's earned the respect of every man on my property, and she did it all while this man," he gestured at Thomas, "was trying to destroy her reputation out of spite. If you want to question someone's character, question his." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Halloran deliberated for less than 10 minutes. When he returned, his expression was stern. "I've reviewed the evidence and heard the testimony," he said, "and I find no merit in the plaintiff's claim. Mr. Garrett, you terminated your engagement with Miss Vale in writing before she even arrived in Texas. Any subsequent offer of marriage was a new proposal, not a continuation of your original agreement, and Miss Vale had every right to refuse it. Your claim for damages is denied, and you will pay court costs. Case dismissed." The gavel came down, and Rosalind felt something break open in her chest. Relief so profound it left her dizzy. Wade's hand was on her shoulder, steadying her. Margaret was gathering papers, a satisfied smile on her face. And Thomas sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, his face pale, his lawyer already packing up to leave. Outside the courthouse, people were waiting, some sympathetic, others still skeptical, but all of them forced to acknowledge what had just happened. Rosalind had won. The abandoned bride had walked into that courtroom and destroyed the man who'd tried to humiliate her. But she wasn't done yet. That evening, as they rode back to the Triple M, Rosalind turned to Wade and said, "We need to file charges against Drummond now, while we have momentum, before he has time to cover his tracks." Wade looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You really don't know how to quit, do you?" "Not when there's still work to do," Rosalind said. And for the first time in weeks, she felt not just determined, but certain. Certain that she could face whatever came next. Certain that she'd built something here that couldn't be torn down by storms or lawsuits or vindictive men. She'd survived. More than that, she'd won. And she wasn't finished winning yet. Margaret Chen returned to the Triple M 3 days after the trial, her saddlebags heavy with documents and her expression grimly satisfied. She spread papers across Wade's desk while Rosalind poured coffee, the morning sun streaming through the office windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to what was about to unfold. "I've been doing some digging," Margaret said, pulling out a thick folder. "After we won your case, I got curious about Frank Drummond's business dealings. Called in some favors with colleagues in San Antonio and Austin. What I found is fascinating." Wade leaned forward. "How fascinating?" "Drummond's been running the same scheme across 3 counties. He identifies struggling ranches, plants someone inside to sabotage their finances, then swoops in with a lowball offer when the owners get desperate. He's acquired 8 properties this way in the last 5 years." Margaret tapped the folder. "But he got greedy. He started using the same bank account for all his fraudulent transactions, probably thinking no one would notice if the amounts were small enough and spread across different operations." Rosalind set down the coffee pot, her pulse quickening. "Can you prove it?" With your ledgers and Vance's letter, I can establish the pattern. But here's where it gets interesting. Margaret pulled out another document. One of those properties Drummond acquired was the Pritchard place, your homestead, Rosalind. What? Rosalind moved closer to the desk. But the land office said it was abandoned, that it would revert to open territory. That's what they were supposed to say, because Drummond paid the clerk to sit on the paperwork and make sure no one filed a claim until he could buy it cheap. Margaret's smile was sharp. But you filed before he could complete the purchase, which means not only did you legally claim that land, you also disrupted his scheme. That's why he's been so aggressive about trying to remove you. Wade's jaw tightened. That clerk at the land office, he's part of this? He was. He left town 2 days ago, right after I started asking questions. But before he ran, he gave me something. Margaret pulled out a sealed envelope. A full confession, names, dates, amounts. He knew Drummond would throw him to the wolves once the investigation started, so he decided to talk first. And what he had to say implicates not just Drummond, but 3 other businessmen in town, including, she paused for effect, Thomas Garrett. The words hung in the air like smoke. Rosalind felt the world tilt slightly, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Thomas was working with Drummond? Not exactly working with him, more like gambling with him. Margaret unfolded a betting ledger. Garrett has substantial gambling debts. He owed Drummond over $2,000. Drummond offered to forgive the debt if Garrett would help discredit you publicly, make you look unstable and unreliable. The lawsuit wasn't about wounded pride, Rosalind. It was a business arrangement. Drummond wanted you gone from that land, and Garrett needed his debts cleared. Wade stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's why he filed the suit right after the tornado destroyed her shelter. They thought she'd be vulnerable, that the scandal would drive her away. Exactly. But they underestimated who they were dealing with. Margaret looked at Rosalind with something like admiration. You didn't just beat the lawsuit, you exposed their whole operation, because once I started pulling at that thread, everything unraveled. Rosalind sat down slowly, her mind racing through implications. What happens now? Now we take this to the county prosecutor. With the clerk's confession, Vance's letter, your ledgers, and the pattern of fraud across multiple properties, we have enough for criminal charges. Conspiracy, fraud, extortion. Drummond's looking at serious prison time. So are his accomplices. Including Thomas? Including Thomas, Margaret confirmed. He participated in a conspiracy to defraud you of your legal property claim. That's a felony. Wade paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. When can we file? I already have. The prosecutor is reviewing the evidence now. He'll likely issue warrants within the week. Margaret began gathering her papers. But you should know. Drummond has resources, connections. This won't be a quick fight. He'll hire expensive lawyers. He'll try to intimidate witnesses. He'll do everything he can to avoid consequences. Let him try. Rosalind's voice was steady, cold. I've got nothing left to lose and everything to prove. If he wants a fight, I'll give him one. Margaret smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, because I'm going to need you to testify. About the ledgers, about Vance's theft, about everything you uncovered. Can you do that? Yes. Even if it means facing Drummond in court? Even if his lawyers try to tear you apart on the stand? Rosalind thought of the shelter she'd built with bleeding hands, of the tornado that had torn it apart, of standing in the courthouse and watching Thomas Garrett's case crumble under the weight of truth. I've faced worse than Frank Drummond's lawyers, she said quietly. I can handle this. But handling it proved more complicated than anyone expected. The warrants were issued 4 days later. Drummond, Thomas Garrett, the land office clerk, and 2 other businessmen arrested on charges of conspiracy and fraud. The town erupted in scandal, newspapers printing lurid headlines about the corruption ring, neighbors turning on neighbors as everyone tried to determine who'd known what and when. And in the middle of it all, Rosalind became the woman who'd brought it all to light. Some people praised her, calling her brave and righteous. Others resented her, claiming she was an outsider who'd stirred up trouble where none existed. The general store clerk refused to serve her. The woman who ran the boarding house crossed the street to avoid her. Even some of Wade's ranch hands looked at her differently now, not with contempt exactly, but with a wariness that hadn't been there before. "They're afraid," Curtis explained one evening when Rosalind asked why Danny had stopped bringing her wildflowers. "You took down some of the most powerful men in the county. That kind of thing makes people nervous. They start wondering what else you might uncover, what other secrets you might expose." "I'm not looking to expose anyone," Rosalind said, frustration leaking into her voice. "I just want to run a homestead and do my work." "I know that. You know that. But people don't think straight when they're scared." Curtis leaned against the barn wall, his weathered face thoughtful. "Give it time. Once the trials are over, once everyone sees that you were just defending yourself, things will settle down." But before things could settle, Drummond made his move. It started with small acts of sabotage: fence posts cut on the Triple M's northern boundary, cattle driven onto neighboring property, supplies going missing from the ranch. Wade doubled the night watch and started having men patrol in pairs, but the harassment continued. Then one of the ranch hands, a quiet man named Pete, who'd worked for Wade for 6 years, quit without explanation, packed his belongings, and left in the middle of the night. "Drummond got to him," Wade said grimly, watching Pete's bunk being stripped by another hand. "Probably offered him money to leave, to testify that working conditions here were poor or that the books were falsified." "Were they?" Rosalind asked. Wade looked at her sharply. "You know they weren't. You've been keeping them yourself for 2 months." "I know, but that's what his lawyers will argue, that I'm the one who falsified everything to frame Drummond, that I fabricated evidence because I was angry about being abandoned by Thomas." She'd been thinking about this constantly, running through every possible attack the defense might launch. "They'll try to make me look vindictive and unstable. Then we make sure everyone knows the truth. We bring witnesses, we show the original ledgers with Vance's handwriting, we—" A shout from outside interrupted him. Curtis was running toward the house, his face pale in the twilight. "Boss, fire at the Pritchard place!" Rosalind's heart stopped. She was out the door before Wade could react, running for the horses. Wade caught up with her as she was saddling the gray, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Let me go first. Let me see how bad it is." It's my land," Rosalind said, her voice shaking. "I'm going." They rode hard through the gathering darkness, the orange glow of flames visible long before they reached the property. When they crested the rise, Rosalind's worst fears were confirmed. The spring, her spring, the one thing that had survived the tornado, was surrounded by burning scrub grass, the flames spreading rapidly in the dry evening wind. Someone had deliberately set fires in a ring around the water source, destroying the vegetation she'd been carefully cultivating, scorching the earth she'd planned to build on. Wade was already dismounting, shouting orders to the ranch hands who'd followed them. They formed a line, beating at the flames with blankets and shovels, creating a fire break to keep the blaze from spreading further. Rosalind joined them, her dress smoking as she stamped out embers, her hands raw from gripping the shovel. It took 2 hours to contain the fire. When it was finally out, Rosalind stood in the blackened circle of her homestead and looked at the destruction. The spring still flowed, the water untouched, but everything around it was ash and charred earth. Years of growth burned away in a single night. Curtis approached, holding something in his hand. "Found this, boss." It was a piece of cloth, expensive fabric that didn't belong on a prairie homestead, and embroidered in one corner was a single letter, D. Wade took it, his expression darkening. "Drummond." "We can't prove it was him," Rosalind said, though her voice was hollow. "He'll say anyone could have planted this. He's trying to scare you off. He's trying to make you abandon the claim before the trial." Wade turned to face her, his eyes fierce. "Don't let him win, Rosalind. Don't give him the satisfaction." "I'm not giving him anything." She looked at the ruined land, at the spring still flowing clear and cold through the devastation. "But I can't rebuild here. Build. Not now. Not with the trial coming. Not with Drummond watching, waiting for another chance to pull." "Then don't rebuild yet. Hold the claim. Work at the ranch. And when this is over, when Drummond's in prison where he belongs, then you build something he can't burn down." Wade's voice was urgent. "But don't walk away. Don't let him take this from you." Rosalind wanted to argue, wanted to point out that staying might get her killed, that maybe the smart thing was to sell the claim and move somewhere safer. But the words wouldn't come, because giving up the land meant giving up the last piece of the future she'd built for herself, meant admitting that men like Drummond could destroy anything they wanted without consequence. "I'll stay," she said finally, "but I need something from you." "Name it." "Help me find out who set this fire. Not just the fabric. I need proof. Witnesses. Something that will stand up in court." She met his eyes. "Because I'm not just defending myself anymore, Mr. Mercer. I'm going after them. All of them. And I want to make sure when I do they can't get back up." Wade smiled, fierce and approving. "Then let's get to work." They started by interviewing everyone who'd been near the Pritchard place in the last week. Curtis remembered seeing riders on the northern ridge 2 days earlier, 3 men who'd ridden off when he'd approached. Danny admitted he'd heard horses passing the ranch late at night several times, always heading toward Rosalind's claim. The pattern was clear. Someone had been watching the property, waiting for the right moment to strike. Rosalind took the information to Margaret, who added it to the growing case file. The prosecutor was building charges not just for the original fraud, but for ongoing harassment, property destruction, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Drummond's lawyers were fighting hard, filing motions to dismiss, to suppress evidence, to delay the trial. But Margaret fought harder, matching them motion for motion, argument for argument. "They're desperate," she told Rosalind during one of their strategy sessions. "Drummond knows if this goes to trial, he's finished. So he's trying everything to avoid it: intimidation, bribery, legal maneuvers. But the evidence is too strong. The prosecutor won't back down." "What about witnesses? Will people actually testify against Drummond?" "Some will. Others are too scared, but we don't need everyone, just enough to establish the pattern." Margaret shuffled papers. "Speaking of which, I got word this morning that Simon Vance has been located. He's in a mining camp in Colorado, and the marshal there is holding him on a fugitive warrant. He'll be extradited back here to face charges." "Will he testify against Drummond?" "If we offer him a deal, he might. Reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation." Margaret looked at Rosalind carefully. "How would you feel about that? About Vance getting a lighter punishment if he helps us put Drummond away?" Rosalind thought about it. Vance had stolen from Wade, had sabotaged the ranch she'd worked so hard to save. The idea of him escaping full justice grated against her sense of fairness. But she also understood the larger picture. Vance was a tool, but Drummond was the hand that wielded it. "If it means stopping Drummond from doing this to someone else, I can live with it," she said finally. Margaret nodded. "Good, because the prosecutor is already drawing up the offer. If Vance agrees, he'll testify to everything: how Drummond recruited him, how the scheme worked, where the money went. It'll be the final nail in Drummond's coffin." The trial was set for 6 weeks out, and in that time, Rosalind threw herself into preparing. She organized the ledgers into clear, undeniable evidence of theft. She practiced her testimony with Margaret, learning how to answer questions clearly and concisely, how to stay calm under aggressive cross-examination, how to present facts without emotion, even when the lawyers tried to provoke her. Wade watched her work with something like awe. "You're better at this than most lawyers I've seen," he said one evening, finding her in the office long after everyone else had gone to bed. "I just want to be ready. I want to walk into that courtroom knowing they can't surprise me with anything." "They'll try anyway. That's what lawyers do." Wade sat down across from her. "But you'll handle it. You always do." Rosalind set down her pen and looked at him, really looked at him. In the months since she'd arrived at the Triple M, Wade Mercer had become more than her employer. He'd become her partner, her defender, her friend. He'd stood by her through the lawsuit with Thomas, through the fire at her homestead, through every moment when the weight of fighting seemed too heavy to bear. And somewhere along the way, her feelings for him had shifted from gratitude to something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster when he walked into a room. "Why do you do it?" she asked quietly. "Why do you keep helping me when it would be easier to just let me handle this alone?" Wade was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because when I found you building that shelter with bleeding hands, I saw someone who refused to break. And I thought, that's the kind of person worth standing beside. The kind of person who makes the world better just by refusing to give up." He met her eyes. "And maybe because somewhere along the way I stopped seeing you as just someone who worked for me and started seeing you as—" He stopped, but Rosalind understood what he wasn't saying. She felt it too, this thing growing between them that was too substantial to ignore but too new to name. After the trial, she said softly. After all this is over. We should talk about this. Yeah, Wade said. We should. The moment hung between them, charged and fragile. Then Curtis appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. Boss, Drummond's men are at the gate. They want to talk. Wade was on his feet instantly. How many? 4, armed. They say they have a message from Drummond, that it's important. Tell them I'll meet them in the yard. And Curtis, get the other men ready, just in case. Rosalind followed Wade outside, the Winchester in her hands. The moon was bright enough to see clearly, illuminating 4 riders sitting their horses just beyond the gate. She recognized one of them, the thin, hard-faced gunman who'd been with Drummond the first time he'd come to the ranch. Wade stopped about 20 feet from the gate, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his stance relaxed but ready. You've got 30 seconds to deliver your message and leave. The thin man smiled, cold and predatory. Mr. Drummond wants you to know he's a reasonable man. He's willing to make a deal. I don't deal with criminals. Hear me out first. Mr. Drummond will drop all legal action. We'll leave you and your ranch alone. We'll even pay for the damages at Miss Vale's property if you convince her to drop the charges and leave Texas. Not interested. You should be, because if those charges proceed to trial, things are going to get real unpleasant. Witnesses might have accidents. Evidence might disappear. The lady's pretty little homestead might burn again, this time with her in it. Wade's hand moved closer to his gun. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. Mr. Drummond has resources, connections. He can make life very difficult for people who cross him. The thin man's smile widened. Or he can make problems go away. Your choice. Rosalind stepped forward before Wade could respond, the rifle raised to her shoulder. Her hands were steady, her voice clear. Tell Mr. Drummond I'm not dropping anything. Tell him I'll see him in court, and when I'm done testifying, he'll spend the rest of his miserable life in prison. And if he sends anyone to my property again, if he threatens me or anyone I care about, I will put a bullet in him myself. That's my answer. The thin man's smile faded. He looked at Wade. You're really going to let her talk to Mr. Drummond like that? She speaks for herself, Wade said quietly. And for what it's worth, I agree with every word. Now get off my land before I have you arrested for trespassing. The 4 men sat there for another moment, tension crackling in the air. Then the thin man spat into the dirt, wheeled his horse around, and rode off into the darkness, his companions following. Wade waited until they were out of sight before turning to Rosalind. You realize you just declared war on one of the most dangerous men in the county. I've been at war with him since I filed that homestead claim. This just makes it official. Rosalind lowered the rifle, adrenaline making her hands shake now that the confrontation was over. Do you think he'll really come after me? Yes. Which is why from now on you don't go anywhere alone. Not to town, not to your property, nowhere. Wade's voice was firm. And we increase security here. Double guards at night, weapons ready. If Drummond wants to escalate this, we'll be ready. The next morning brought news that validated Wade's caution. One of the witnesses Margaret had lined up to testify, a former ranch hand who'd worked for Drummond and could corroborate the pattern of fraud, was found beaten half to death in an alley behind a saloon. He survived, but he refused to testify, claimed he'd been drunk and fallen, wouldn't say who'd attacked him. That's 3 witnesses we've lost to intimidation, Margaret said, her frustration evident. The clerk fled, Pete disappeared, and now Anderson is too scared to talk, Drummond systematically eliminating anyone who could hurt him. What about Vance? Rosalind asked. Still in Colorado, still under guard. The prosecutor is keeping his location secret until the trial. He's the key witness. If we can get him on the stand, the rest doesn't matter. If we can get him there alive, Wade said darkly. The weeks crawled by, each one bringing new acts of sabotage or intimidation. Rosalind's mail was tampered with. Someone broke into the ranch office and scattered the ledgers, though nothing was taken. Curtis found a dead coyote nailed to the fence post with a note attached, "Back off." Through it all, Rosalind kept working, kept preparing, kept refusing to bend. She testified before the grand jury, presenting the evidence so clearly that they indicted Drummond on 12 counts. She gave depositions to the prosecutor's office, walking them through every discrepancy in the books. And when Thomas Garrett's lawyer approached her with an offer, he'd plead guilty to a lesser charge and testify against Drummond if she agreed not to pursue additional charges. She agreed, because putting Drummond away mattered more than punishing Thomas. The trial began on a cold morning in November, the courthouse packed with spectators who'd come to watch the scandal of the decade unfold. Drummond sat at the defense table flanked by 3 expensive lawyers, his face carefully composed into an expression of injured innocence. Thomas sat separately, his plea agreement already filed, his role reduced to that of witness rather than defendant. The prosecutor opened strong, laying out the conspiracy in clear, devastating terms. He presented the ledgers, showed the jury the pattern of theft, explained how Drummond had used Vance to sabotage the Triple M while simultaneously planning to buy it cheap. He called witness after witness, ranch hands, suppliers, even the banker who'd processed the fraudulent transactions and who'd agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. Then he called Rosalind. She walked to the witness stand feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom, feeling the intensity of Drummond's stare like a physical pressure. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. The prosecutor started with foundation questions, establishing who she was and why she'd been hired at the Triple M. Then he asked her to explain what she'd found in Wade's books. Rosalind took a breath and began walking the jury through it. The ghost workers, the falsified invoices, the pattern of theft that had drained thousands from the ranch. She showed them the ledgers with Vance's handwriting, explained how she'd traced the discrepancies, pointed out the connections between the timing of the theft and Drummond's offers to buy the property. "And did you find any direct evidence linking Mr. Drummond to this scheme?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes. A letter from Mr. Drummond to Simon Vance, instructing him to continue creating the appearance of financial difficulty and promising compensation when the property transferred." The prosecutor entered the letter into evidence and had Rosalind read it aloud. The jury leaned forward, their attention fixed on every word. Then came the cross-examination. Drummond's lead lawyer was a silver-haired man named Patterson, who'd built a career defending the wealthy and powerful. He approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who'd destroyed countless witnesses before. "Miss Vale, you claim to have found all these discrepancies in Mr. Mercer's ledgers. But isn't it true that you had a personal vendetta against my client?" "No, sir." "You filed a homestead claim on land that Mr. Drummond wanted to purchase, did you not?" "I filed a legal claim on abandoned property, yes." "And when Mr. Drummond objected to your claim, you became angry, didn't you? Angry enough to fabricate evidence to discredit him?" "I didn't fabricate anything." "The evidence speaks for itself." Patterson smiled, cold and patronizing. "Does it? Or did a woman scorned by Thomas Garrett, humiliated in front of the whole town, decide to strike back at the men she blamed for her misfortune by inventing a conspiracy?" The prosecutor objected, but the damage was done. Rosalind could see some jury members looking at her differently now, doubt creeping into their expressions. She forced herself to stay calm, to remember Margaret's coaching. "Mr. Patterson," she said clearly, "I came to Texas expecting to marry Thomas Garrett. He broke that promise before I even arrived. I could have left. I could have gone home. Instead, I claimed land and found work. When Mr. Mercer hired me to organize his books, I discovered theft that would have bankrupted him if it had continued. I didn't invent that. The numbers don't lie." "Numbers can be manipulated, Miss Vale, especially by someone with your admitted skill at bookkeeping." "Then explain Simon Vance's letter. Explain the clerk's confession. Explain why 3 separate ranches that rejected Mr. Drummond's purchase offers all experienced similar financial problems right before he acquired them." Rosalind leaned forward slightly. "I didn't fabricate any of that, Mr. Patterson. Your client did it, and now he's trying to make me the villain so he can escape the consequences." Patterson's smile tightened. He tried several more angles of attack, but Rosalind held firm, answering each question with facts backed by evidence. When he finally dismissed her, she walked back to her seat with her head high, knowing she'd done everything she could. The trial continued for 3 more days. Vance testified, brought in under heavy guard, his voice shaking but his story clear and damning. He admitted everything, confirmed Drummond's involvement, described the conspiracy in detail that left no room for doubt. Thomas testified briefly, admitting his role in the harassment lawsuit, explaining the gambling debts that had motivated his cooperation. And through it all, Drummond sat silent, his expensive lawyers fighting to poke holes in the prosecution's case. But the evidence was too strong, the witnesses too credible. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict on all 12 counts. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Drummond's face went white, then red. His lawyers immediately filed notice of appeal, but the judge set bail so high that even Drummond couldn't make it. He was taken away in chains, still protesting his innocence, still threatening revenge. Rosalind sat in the courthouse long after everyone else had left, the empty benches echoing with the ghosts of testimony and argument. Wade found her there, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "Is it?" Rosalind looked up at him. "Drummond still has his lawyers, his appeals. This could drag on for years." "Maybe, but he's in jail, his reputation is destroyed, and everyone knows what he did. That's a win, Rosalind." She nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the last months finally beginning to lift. "What happens now?" "Now you rebuild," Wade said. "You go back to your homestead, you dig a proper well, you build a house that'll stand for 100 years, and you live the life you came here to build." "Alone?" Wade was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That depends. There's something I've been wanting to ask you, something I should have asked weeks ago." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple gold ring, no diamond, no elaborate setting, just honest gold that caught the fading sunlight through the courthouse windows. "Rosalind Vale, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You've saved my ranch, exposed corruption, and refused to break no matter how hard this world tried to bend you. And somewhere in all that, I fell in love with you." His voice was steady, certain. "So I'm asking, will you marry me? Will you build that future with me as my partner in everything?" Rosalind looked at the ring, at Wade's face, at the future suddenly opening before her like a door she'd thought was locked forever. She thought of Thomas Garrett's letter, of arriving in Texas with nothing but broken promises. She thought of building a shelter with bleeding hands, of fighting storms and lawsuits, and men who'd tried to destroy her. And she thought of Wade Mercer, who'd seen her at her lowest and offered her not pity, but respect, not rescue, but partnership. "Yes," she said, and took the ring. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her there in the empty courtroom, and Rosalind felt something settle in her chest. Not just love, though that was there, but certainty. She'd come to Texas alone and afraid. She was leaving this courthouse as a woman who'd built herself a life worth living, with a partner worth standing beside. The future was still uncertain. Drummond might appeal. The ranch would face new challenges. Her homestead would take years to build into something sustainable. But for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Rosalind wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready for it. The wedding was small, held on a Sunday afternoon at the Triple M with Margaret Chen standing as witness and Curtis giving Rosalind away since her own father was 1,000 miles distant and had never replied to the letter she'd sent announcing her engagement. The ranch hands lined up in their cleanest shirts. Danny held a bouquet of late-season wildflowers he'd ridden 6 miles to find, and the minister from town performed the ceremony under a cottonwood tree while the November wind whispered through the branches overhead. Rosalind wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Wade had bought in San Antonio, simple cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar that Margaret had contributed from her own collection. Wade wore his best suit, the one he saved for court appearances and funerals, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady even though she could see emotion working in his throat. "I promise to stand beside you," he said quietly, the traditional vows already spoken, these words his own. "In every storm, every fight, every moment when the world tries to break us. I promise to see you as you are, strong and brilliant and unbreakable, and never ask you to be less than that." Rosalind's eyes burned, but her voice was clear when she responded. "I promise to build with you, not just a ranch or a home, but a life worth fighting for. I promise to never stop fighting, never stop building, never stop believing we can make something good from even the hardest ground." The minister pronounced them married, and Wade kissed her while the ranch hands cheered and Curtis wiped his eyes with his bandana and pretended he had dust in them. They celebrated with a meal Rosalind and Margaret had prepared together: roasted beef, fresh bread, apple pie made from fruit Curtis had brought from town. The hands ate and laughed and told stories, and for one evening, the shadow of Drummond's trial and all the ugliness that had preceded it seemed very far away. But the shadow returned the next morning in the form of a rider carrying a telegram. Wade read it, his expression darkening, and handed it to Rosalind without a word. Drummond had made bail. Some investor from back east, someone with more money than sense, or perhaps more interest in Drummond's schemes than anyone had realized, had posted the $50,000. Drummond was free pending his appeal, with restrictions on his movements, but otherwise able to walk the streets, conduct business, and make life difficult for everyone who'd testified against him. How? Rosalind asked, her hands tightening on the paper. The judge set bail so high specifically to keep him locked up. Rich men always find a way, Wade said grimly, but the restrictions are tight. He can't leave the county, he can't contact witnesses, and he's required to check in with the sheriff twice a week. If he violates any of those conditions, he goes straight back to jail. You think that'll stop him? No. I think he'll find ways around it, same as he's found ways around everything else. Wade took the telegram back and set it on the desk. But we knew this wasn't over. Drummond's not the type to accept defeat quietly. He was right. Within a week, problems started appearing. Fences were cut again, but this time on multiple properties. Not just the Triple M, but neighboring ranches as well, creating confusion about who was being targeted. Supplies ordered by Wade arrived damaged or incomplete. The merchants claiming shipping errors, but unable to explain why it only happened to the Triple M's orders. And twice, Rosalind found evidence that someone had been on her homestead at night. Boot prints near the spring, signs of digging where she'd planned to build. He's testing us, Wade said, examining the boot prints, seeing how far he can push before we react. Then we don't react. We document everything. We report it to the sheriff, and we make sure there's a clear record of harassment. Rosalind was already writing notes in the small book she'd started carrying for exactly this purpose. When his appeal fails, when he goes to prison, we want every violation documented so he can't claim he was a model citizen during the process. But documentation required proof, and proof required catching someone in the act. Wade organized night watches, rotating the ranch hands in shifts to patrol the property and Rosalind's homestead. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then on a cold December night, Danny came racing back to the main house with news that someone was at the Pritchard place, multiple riders, and they were digging near the spring. Wade and Rosalind rode out with Curtis and 4 other hands, armed and moving fast through the darkness. When they crested the rise above the homestead, they could see lanterns bobbing near the spring, hear the sound of shovels biting into earth. Wade signaled the men to spread out, to surround the site quietly, and they moved into position with the practiced efficiency of men who'd worked together for years. Now, Wade said, and they rode in. The men at the spring scattered immediately, dropping tools and running for their horses. But the Triple M hands had blocked the escape routes, and within minutes they'd corralled all 4 intruders. 3 were strangers, rough-looking men who clearly hired their services to whoever paid. But the 4th, the one who'd been directing the digging, was Simon Vance. Wade's gun was in his hand before Vance could reach his horse. "On the ground, now!" Vance froze, his hands rising slowly. In the lantern light, his face was haggard, desperate, nothing like the confident foreman who'd worked at the Triple M months earlier. "Mercer, listen. I said on the ground." Wade's voice was ice. Vance dropped to his knees, then flat, and Curtis moved in to bind his hands while the other ranch hands secured the remaining intruders. Rosalind dismounted and walked to the spring, looking at what they'd been digging. A hole, maybe 4 feet deep, and at the bottom, a leather satchel. She climbed down and retrieved it, her heart pounding. Inside were documents, deeds, transfer papers, bank records, and every single one of them was forged. "What is this?" she demanded, climbing back out and opening the satchel in the lantern light. Vance wouldn't meet her eyes. "Insurance. Insurance for what?" "For Drummond. He knew the appeal wouldn't work. So he sent me back to plant evidence on your property, Evidence that would make it look like you'd been part of the scheme all along, that you'd falsified documents to frame him. Vance's voice was bitter, defeated. He was going to discover these papers, turn them over to the authorities, claim you'd manipulated everything. Reasonable doubt, that's all he needed, just enough to get a mistrial. Wade's expression was murderous. You were supposed to be in Colorado. I was, until Drummond paid someone to help me escape. Promised me $20,000 to come back and do this one last job. Vance laughed, a broken sound. I should have known better. Should have known he'd throw me under the wagon the first chance he got. But I was desperate, and desperate men do stupid things. Where's Drummond now? Rosalind asked. Back in town, probably sitting in his hotel suite drinking expensive whiskey and waiting for news that the job's done. Vance looked up at her, something like regret in his eyes. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about all of it. He convinced me it would be easy money, that Mercer wouldn't notice, that nobody would get hurt. I didn't realize what I was helping him build until it was too late. You had choices, Wade said coldly. You could have said no. You could have walked away. Instead, you stole from me, you sabotaged my ranch, and now you were trying to destroy an innocent woman's life to save your own skin. I know. Vance's voice was hollow. I know what I am. But Drummond, he's worse. He doesn't care who he destroys as long as he gets what he wants, and he won't stop. Even if this didn't work, even if you caught me, he'll find another way. He always does. Rosalind looked at the forged documents, at Vance on the ground, at Wade's tight expression. Then she made a decision. Take him to the sheriff, she said, and take these documents as evidence. We're filing new charges: conspiracy, forgery, witness tampering, and escape from custody. And this time, we're making sure Drummond doesn't see the outside of a cell until he's too old to hurt anyone. They rode back to town in the pre-dawn darkness, Vance and the other intruders bound and guarded, the satchel of evidence secure in Rosalind's hands. The sheriff was less than pleased to be woken before sunrise, but his expression changed when he saw what they'd brought him. He locked all 4 men in cells and sent word to the prosecutor immediately. By noon, the prosecutor had filed emergency motions to revoke Drummond's bail. By evening, a judge had signed the order, and deputies were on their way to arrest him. But when they reached Drummond's hotel, they found his suite empty, his belongings gone, and the desk clerk claiming he'd checked out hours earlier. He ran, the sheriff said, standing in Drummond's abandoned rooms. Someone must have tipped him off that Vance was caught. Then find him, Wade said. Put out notices, alert the marshals, search every road out of town. We will. But Mercer, if he had a few hours head start, he could be anywhere by now. Mexico, California, somewhere we'll never find him. Rosalind stood by the window, looking out at the town street below, and felt fury settle cold and heavy in her chest. After everything, after all the fighting and testimony and evidence, Drummond was going to escape. He was going to disappear into the vastness of the West and leave them with nothing but an empty room and unanswered questions. No, she said quietly. The sheriff turned. Ma'am? He's not gone. He wouldn't run, not permanently. Everything he's built is here. His properties, his businesses, his reputation. He's too arrogant to abandon all that. She turned from the window. He's hiding somewhere close, waiting to see if the charges stick, waiting for an opportunity to turn this around. That's a big assumption, Mrs. Mercer, the sheriff said. It's not an assumption. It's who he is. Rosalind moved to Drummond's desk and started going through the papers he'd left behind. Most were ordinary, business correspondence, bills, receipts. But at the bottom of a drawer, she found a ledger, and when she opened it, her breath caught. It was an accounting of properties, not just the ones Drummond owned, but ones he was planning to acquire. And one of them, marked with a date 2 weeks in the future, was a notation about a hunting cabin on the northern edge of the county, a place he'd apparently used before for private meetings. Here, she said, showing the entry to Wade and the sheriff. This is where he'd go. Somewhere remote, somewhere he controls, somewhere he can wait out the search. The sheriff studied the ledger, his skepticism gradually giving way to consideration. It's possible. That cabin's pretty isolated. If he's got supplies stored there, then we go get him, Wade said. Tonight. They rode out at dusk, a party of 8, including Wade, Rosalind, the sheriff, and 5 deputies. The cabin was a 2-hour ride through rough country, and they approached carefully, leaving the horses tied a quarter-mile away and moving in on foot. Lights showed in the cabin windows, smoke rose from the chimney, and through the glass they could see movement inside. The sheriff positioned his men around the cabin, blocking all exits. Then he stepped up to the door and hammered on it with his fist. "Frank Drummond! This is Sheriff Hayes. You're under arrest. Come out with your hands visible." Silence. Then the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, barricading the door. "Drummond, don't make this harder than it needs to be." A voice from inside, muffled but recognizable. "You've got no right to arrest me. I made bail legally." "Your bail's been revoked. You've got new charges, conspiracy, witness tampering, forgery, and you fled when you knew we were coming for you. That's all the right I need." The sheriff's voice was hard. "Now come out, or we come in."
"Go to hell!" The sheriff looked at Wade, who nodded. Two deputies moved forward with a thick log they'd cut from a fallen tree, using it as a battering ram. 3 strikes, and the door splintered inward. The deputies rushed in, guns drawn, and Rosalind heard shouting, the crash of furniture, and then silence. When she and Wade entered the cabin, they found Drummond on the floor, hands cuffed behind his back, his face red with rage and humiliation. The cabin was well stocked with food and supplies, enough for weeks of hiding. But now it was over. The sheriff hauled Drummond to his feet. "Frank Drummond, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, witness tampering, forgery, and attempted flight from justice. Anything you say, this is persecution," Drummond shouted, his composure finally cracking. "That woman," he glared at Rosalind, "she's behind all of this. She fabricated evidence. She manipulated the courts. She saved my ranch," Wade said quietly.
"She exposed your crimes, and she's the reason you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You tried to break her, Drummond. You burned her land. You filed false charges. You sent men to intimidate her. And she beat you anyway. That must really eat at you, losing to a woman you thought was nobody." Drummond's face went purple, but he had no response. The sheriff led him outside, loaded him onto a horse, and they rode back to town through the night. By the time they arrived, word had already spread. People lined the streets, watching in silence as the man who'd terrorized the county for years was brought in shackled and defeated. The prosecutor moved fast after that. With Vance's testimony, the forged documents, and Drummond's attempted flight, there was no chance of bail being granted again. The appeal was denied within a week. Drummond's trial on the new charges was set for February, and in the meantime, he sat in a cell with no visitors, no deals, and no way out. Rosalind watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction, but she didn't let it consume her. There was too much else to do. The homestead needed rebuilding, the ranch needed management, and she had a life to build that was about more than revenge or justice. She started with the spring. Wade helped her line it with stone, creating a proper well that would last decades. They built a small dam to create a reservoir, ensuring water even in dry seasons. And then, working with Curtis and the ranch hands on Sundays, they began building a house. Not a shelter this time, a real house, with a foundation sunk deep, walls made of stone and timber that could weather any storm, and a roof that wouldn't leak or blow away. They worked through the winter, through cold days when their breath fogged and their fingers went numb, through snow that delayed progress but never stopped it entirely. Danny proved surprisingly skilled at carpentry, creating window frames and door jambs with an artist's precision. Curtis taught Rosalind how to mix mortar properly, how to lay stone so it would hold for generations. And Wade worked alongside them all, his strong back and steady hands helping to raise the walls that would become their future home. By spring, the house was habitable, 4 rooms and a porch, with space to expand when they needed it. Rosalind planted a garden near the spring, using seeds she'd saved and others she'd bought from the general store whose clerk had finally started treating her with grudging respect. She planted vegetables for eating, herbs for medicine, and flowers. Because Wade had mentioned once that his mother had loved flowers, and he'd forgotten what it felt like to see them growing near a home. The second trial came and went, Drummond convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was taken away still protesting his innocence, still claiming he'd been set up, but nobody was listening anymore. The appeals dragged on for a few more months before being exhausted,
And finally, mercifully, it was truly over. Thomas Garrett left town shortly after testifying, gone back east where nobody knew about his failures and his debts. Rosalind heard months later that he'd married a widow with money and was working in her family's business. She felt nothing when she heard the news, not satisfaction, not anger, just a distant sense that he was someone she used to know in a different life. Simon Vance received 10 years for his cooperation, a sentence he accepted with weary resignation. Before he was transferred to prison, he sent a letter to the Triple M, addressed to Rosalind. She read it once, a rambling apology full of regrets and self-justification, and then burned it in the kitchen stove. Some things didn't deserve preservation. Life settled into new rhythms. Rosalind divided her time between the ranch and the homestead, keeping Wade's books in perfect order while slowly building her own property into something productive. She raised chickens, sold eggs in town, and used the money to buy lumber for a barn. Wade helped her acquire cattle, just a few at first, but enough to start a small herd that could grow over time. The ranch hands who'd been skeptical of her at first became her strongest supporters. Danny married a girl from town and asked Rosalind to stand up at his wedding because, as he said with his characteristic earnestness, she'd shown him that courage wasn't about never being afraid, but about doing what needed to be done anyway. Curtis became a regular fixture at the homestead, showing up on Sundays to help with whatever project needed extra hands, and eventually admitting he'd grown fond of the place, of the quiet and the possibility it represented. Margaret Chen became more than just a lawyer. She became a friend, writing out to the Triple M once a month to share news and conversation, to help Rosalind navigate the legal complexities of land ownership and business partnerships. And when Wade formally made Rosalind a co-owner of the Triple M, it was Margaret who drew up the papers, ensuring everything was documented properly and that Rosalind's claim to the property was as solid as the stone walls of her house. On their first anniversary, Wade took Rosalind to the highest point on the Triple M property, a ridge that looked out over both the ranch and her homestead. They sat on the sun-warmed rock and looked at everything they'd built together. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Wade said, his arm around her shoulders. "That day I found you trying to build a shelter with warped boards and bleeding hands. I almost rode away. I almost decided you were crazy and it wasn't my problem. But you didn't. No, because I saw something in you that day. Something that reminded me of everyone I'd ever known who was worth a damn. They all had that same stubborn refusal to quit even when quitting would have been easier." He pulled her closer. "I'm glad I didn't ride away, Rosalind." "So am I." She leaned into him, watching the sun paint the prairie in gold. "You know what I think about? That letter from Thomas. How I felt when I read it, like my whole future had just been torn away, and how angry I was, how humiliated. And now? Now I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because if he'd kept his promise, I would have married him. I would have spent my life depending on someone weak and selfish, never knowing what I was capable of building on my own." She looked at Wade. "I would never have met you, never have claimed this land, never have learned that I'm strong enough to weather any storm that comes." Wade kissed her, soft and certain, and they sat there as the sun set and the stars began to emerge, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. 2 years after the trial, Rosalind stood in the doorway of her house, their house now, as Wade had sold the main ranch house and moved to the homestead permanently, leaving Curtis to manage the Triple M's daily operations, and watched the prairie grass ripple in the wind. The garden was thriving, the barn was finished, and the cattle herd had grown to nearly 50 head. They'd weathered drought and storms, market fluctuations, and difficult seasons, but they'd weathered them together. A rider appeared on the horizon, and Rosalind recognized Danny's silhouette. He'd brought the mail from town, a weekly duty he'd volunteered for because it gave him an excuse to visit. He dismounted and handed her a bundle of letters and newspapers, his young face split in a grin. "Got something special today, Mrs. Mercer. Letter from back east." Rosalind sorted through the mail and found it, an envelope with her father's handwriting, the first communication she'd received from him since leaving St. Louis. She took it inside, made coffee, and sat at the table to read. Her father's letter was stiff, formal, but underneath the formality she could read his difficulty in finding words. He'd heard about the trial from newspapers that had carried the story, had read about her testimony and her homestead and her marriage to a rancher. He wrote that he was proud of her, that he'd been wrong to doubt she could make her own way, that he hoped someday she might forgive him for not supporting her decision to come to Texas. Rosalind read the letter twice, then set it aside and looked out the window at the land she'd claimed with $14 in desperation. Her father's approval meant something, but it didn't mean everything. Not anymore. She'd learned to build her life on her own terms, to measure her worth by her own standards, rather than anyone else's expectations. That evening, she showed the letter to Wade. He read it silently, then handed it back. "You going to write him?" "Eventually, but not to ask for his forgiveness or his blessing. Just to tell him I'm doing well, that I'm happy, that I built something worth having." She folded the letter carefully. "He can accept that or not. Either way, I'll be fine." Wade smiled. "You know what I love about you? You never needed anyone to save you. You just needed people to get out of your way and let you build." "Not entirely true. I needed you." She took his hand. "Not to save me, but to stand beside me, to help me when I needed help and let me fight when I needed to fight. That's different than being saved." "Yeah," Wade said quietly. "It is." 5 years after stepping off the train in Cassidy Junction, Rosalind stood on her porch and surveyed her world. The homestead had grown into a small but prosperous ranch, running cattle alongside the Triple M and earning enough to be sustainable. The house had been expanded twice, with 2 additional rooms and a larger kitchen that could accommodate the meals she cooked for hired hands during peak seasons. The garden had matured into an established plot that provided vegetables year-round, and she'd started selling produce in town alongside her eggs. The town itself had changed, too. New businesses had opened after Drummond's empire collapsed, entrepreneurs moving in to fill the vacuum his arrest had created. The general store had new owners who actually smiled when Rosalind came in. The boarding house was under new management, and the courthouse, site of so much drama and conflict, was being expanded to handle the growing population as more settlers arrived and claimed their own pieces of the prairie. Rosalind had become something unexpected in those 5 years. A woman people asked for advice. Other women who'd come west alone or under difficult circumstances sought her out, wanting to know how she'd survived, how she'd fought, how she'd built something from nothing. She told them the truth, that she'd bled for it, that she'd been terrified, that there were nights she'd wanted to quit. But she'd kept building anyway, one nail at a time, one day at a time, until the shelter became a house, and the house became a home, and the home became a life. Curtis retired from active ranch management, but stayed on at the Triple M as an advisor, his wisdom valued by the younger hands who'd replaced the men who'd scattered after Drummond's arrest. Danny and his wife had their first child, a daughter they named Rose after Rosalind, and Danny brought her to the homestead regularly so she could grow up knowing the woman she'd been named for. Margaret Chen opened her own law practice in town, specializing in property rights and contracts, and she credited Rosalind's case as the foundation of her reputation. And Wade remained constant, steady, the partner Rosalind had promised to build with. They worked together, argued sometimes, made decisions jointly, and created a life that belonged to both of them equally. The ranch prospered under their combined management. Wade's knowledge of cattle and land complemented by Rosalind's skill with numbers and planning. On a warm evening in September, 10 years after Rosalind had first arrived in Texas, they sat on the porch of their home and watched the sun set over land that had once seemed hostile and unforgiving, but now felt like exactly where they belonged. The prairie grass rippled in the wind, cattle grazed in the distance, and smoke rose from the chimney of the house they'd built together. "You ever regret it?" Wade asked, the question he'd asked before, and would probably ask again. "Coming here? Fighting for this?" Rosalind thought about Thomas Garrett's letter, about the cruel note that had seemed like the end of everything. She thought about building a shelter in the dust, about facing down Drummond and his lawyers, about every moment when giving up would have been easier than continuing. "Not once," she said, "not for a single moment. Even when it was hard? Especially when it was hard, because that's when I learned what I was made of." She took his hand. "I came to Texas with nothing but a broken promise and a suitcase full of expectations that didn't belong to me. And I built something real, something that can't be taken away by storms or lawsuits or men who think women should know their place." Wade lifted her hand and kissed it. "You built more than something real.
You built something extraordinary. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, as the night sounds of the prairie rose around them, crickets and cattle and the whisper of wind through grass. And Rosalind thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. She'd arrived in Texas expecting to be saved, to be given a future by someone else's grace. Instead, she'd saved herself. She'd claimed a future with her own bleeding hands, built it nail by nail and choice by choice, fought for it when everyone said she should quit, and she'd won. Not because someone had rescued her, though Wade had stood beside her when she needed support, not because the system had protected her, though justice had eventually prevailed, but because she'd refused to break, refused to believe that her worth was determined by anyone's opinion or promise or approval. The Texas prairie had tried to break her with storms and heat and isolation. Men had tried to break her with abandonment and fraud and intimidation. Society had tried to break her with scandal and judgment and expectations that a woman alone should fail. But Rosalind Vale Mercer had built a shelter from warped boards, had turned $14 into a homestead, had transformed broken promises into a partnership worth having. She'd stood in courtrooms and faced down enemies, had rebuilt after destruction, had planted gardens in scorched earth. And she was still building, still standing, still proving every single day that the future belonged to those brave enough to claim it and strong enough to fight for it. The prairie stretched before her, vast and beautiful and hers. And Rosalind smiled, knowing that whatever came next, drought or plenty, conflict or peace, challenges or victories, she would face it the same way she'd faced everything since stepping off that train. With courage, with determination, and with hands that had learned long ago that the only shelter worth having was the one you built yourself.